And we're live. Morning, everybody, or good afternoon, as the case may be. Just jumping on for a minute for a couple of reasons. One, I'm so excited to have an upcoming countdown, like a panel discussion between myself, the boxing librarian, and Scrapbook Boxing. We don't have a date to announce yet. We're working out the details on that front, but it's set. We're going to be counting down our individual top 10 greatest greatest middleweights in boxing history. And I'm assuming we're restricting ourselves to the gloved era, which is well over 100 years, plenty to look at. And we haven't defined the term greatest, so I'm going to explain why and why that's more fun and kind of appropriate for a panel discussion. And then secondly, I'm going to celebrate the countdown, talk about why the term greatest is immeasurably broad, and also why it can be useful not to necessarily set a criteria for discussion. So we're not doing a debate, we're just having a discussion. So I feel it's appropriate, and I wanted to explain why, because I love to talk about fights and boxing history. And then lastly, I just wanted to respond to a comment that I got under the last countdown that BL, Scrapbook, and myself did on our top 10 heavyweights of the first quarter of the 1900s. And it was regarding Sam Langford and the great Harry Wills and their relative position in the way we were judging it. So I just thought I'd explain that. Why not? Thanks to everyone listening after the fact. Hope you're having a fantastic day or evening, night, whichever part of the day it is. I hope it's going really well for you. And so I guess the thrust of what I initially intended to talk about was that, we're getting ready to do this middleweight countdown. So we haven't defined what constitutes a middleweight. We haven't defined what constitutes the greatest, quote unquote. And we didn't even set a time frame. So technically someone would go, hey, in 1700, this guy, it's fine. We haven't really, there are a few assumed things on my part, but really we're leaving it very vague, and that's for good reason. And I'm not going to talk long. Actually, my phone is dying. Oh my goodness. But anyway, so here's some guys who fought and did very well at middleweight in their careers. But, depending on what someone was looking for, they could come up with some dramatically different lists as far as greatness. And that's because, so when we're, the term great, you could say, oh, this thing was great, as in it was just a great short moment to enjoy. Or you could say someone did great, as in that night they were in top form, they did something special. But usually when we're talking historical athletes and we say great, we mean the accumulation of accomplishment. And so I don't know what to expect from this countdown. I've enjoyed the previous two we did. We did the top 5 seasons of the great Harry Greb, the three of us, and we didn't set criteria. We didn't say what do you think is the toughest. We didn't really have that discussion behind the scenes. We just went ahead and just showed up on the day, and we actually agreed on some of the years. Either two or all three of us agreed for certain years, but then and then others we had different opinions. And then the three of us, we counted down top 10 heavyweights, 1900 to 1925, and all three lists were different, although we did agree on certain things, all three of us, or two of the three. And the reason I think with a discussion rather than a debate, when you use a term as broad as greatest, is because, one, for the people involved, we don't necessarily want to know how we're all thinking going into it, so that we can get some enjoyment, some academic stimulation, but also so that we're not talking each other into positions or haggling over positions, because we're just really, like, when you just say greatness, you're like, okay, so how does it make you feel? What's the glow coming off of this athlete, depending on what you value? So we're not supposed to be for pure discussion. We're not necessarily supposed to be sharing value standards. We're coming with from our own roots of producing the tree, three unique trees. And so, like, regarding this middleweight countdown, this is a storied division. I mean, so many of the all-time greats either passed through middleweight, spent substantial time there, or were practically career middleweights. We haven't talked about, BL Scrap, myself, we really haven't discussed whether we're talking about the greatest fighters to have been middleweights, or we're talking about the greatest middleweight resumes, or we're talking about the greatest resumes that someone put together while they were a middleweight. Because if you go far enough back, guys would fight outside of their class, but they might still be walking around as middleweights. They're just fighting someone with 30 pounds of them. So, we're talking greatest. Sometimes those weight jumpers, you can say, my goodness, he was only a middleweight and he fought this guy. We don't mean like swelling up to become the heavyweight class. We mean like at times there are guys like Harry Greb, Sam Langford, Bob Fitzsimmons, where they were middleweights, but the opponent wasn't. And I think it's fair to count that toward greatness. Like, if that's what really, brings someone's bell, like, go ahead. It's whatever fills your cup, because all the fighters that we'll be bringing up are all great in their own ways. And there are arguments against them depending on what criteria someone had. It's like Fitzsimmons. Yeah, if you look at his middleweight resume, is it gigantic? No. But when he was that size, if you start looking when he was weight traveling, he was never a big guy. He was a skinny dude. So someone might hold that over someone like, say, Monzon, who was phenomenally successful, early losses in his career and then just went unbeaten for ages and just spent his time in that bracket, much as, say, Joe Calzaghe spent his time at super middle. The very end of his career, he jumped up to light heavy, but he was pretty much a career super middle. So if you said, well, who's the greatest super middleweight of all time? Someone could put forward Calzaghe, but other people would put different fighters, even if the actual time they spent at that bracket was shorter. Maybe they think they're greater overall. And so the burst of greatness they exhibited while they were at that weight outweighs the gigantic resume strictly at that weight. And, because depending on what someone was or wasn't thinking along those lines, you could have someone like Sam Langford. If you talk about a man who's walking around as a middleweight and fighting above his size as well as at that weight, that's pretty tough to top that resume, because so much of his career he wasn't even up at light heavy. He was just, so that's pretty tough. But there's certainly others. Harry Greb, I mean, he was fighting middleweight, but he fought Hall of Famers at light heavy, and he fought heavyweight contenders and beat heavyweight contenders. And Fitzsimmons too, like, yes, he was a 3-weight champion, but he didn't bulk up dramatically to go be a heavyweight. He just went ahead and fought heavyweights as his own skinny dude self. Then you got guys like Mickey Walker up there in the top right, who was hugely successful at welterweight and then middleweight. And so some people would say, well, because he was so great before he moved up, and then he was great at that weight, and he fought a little bit above that weight, maybe he should be in there as the greatest. But with Walker, there are some fighters he didn't fight that maybe argue against him. Then you have someone like up there in the top of the arms crossed, the great Stanley Cattrall, the Michigan assassin. He was fantastically good. He died in his 20s, died in his early 20s. So he didn't get to build a resume someone like a Mickey Walker or Ray Robinson or Langford or some of these other guys built, because he passed away young. But he was great, and goodness knows what he would have gone on to do. So some people would say, well, look at his trajectory and his ability. Yes, it was cut short, but he was so great, and then he got cut short. So there's no rule that you say, oh, well, the guy's not that great because he didn't go and do it. Well, if they were on their way to doing even bigger things than the greatness they had already established, well, Maybe some people that does it for him. You got like marvelous Marvin Hagler, fantastic fighter. He checks a lot of the boxes, if not all the boxes, except less so the weight jumping, but practically every other box he checks several times. And so for a lot of people, they would hold him at the top. I saw a debate on Twitter between some of the fellas. They were sort of like way in between Hagler and Monzon. And that's partly what made me think to come on and do this, because that's happening while I'm puzzling out my top 10 greatest and trying to figure out what my version of greatest is for this kind of countdown. Then you have Ray Robinson. I mean, he was great across several weights. And at middleweight, you could say, well, look how great it was that he was competing for world titles way, way into his career. He was old, still fighting at a world-class level, not always getting beaten that way. And he was able to recapture belts. Some people would hold that higher than, say, Monzon, who didn't lose the belt. Well, Ray Robinson lost, fought some great fighters and lost, but then came back and still managed to capture titles. So, it's similar to the debate, say, between Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was multiple-time champion. Joe Louis was just the champ and didn't lose it, and then he got old and he lost it. But both incredibly great. How the individual would rate it, that's totally subjective. And so to circle back to us not setting a criteria and using what at least I've been referring to as a floating criteria, meaning it could be anything. It's just a word. So three boxing history enthusiasts are getting together, and we're all just asking ourselves, what are we thinking of when we say greatest in this context? And then who makes our list under that? There's no real wrong answers. There might be some hilarious answers as a joke, but there's no, any kind of reasoned list. And I've been looking at more and more boxing all-time pound for pound lists and things of that nature on Twitter lately. And there's some dramatically differing lists out there. But really, I try not to judge, and I just try to think about maybe why they would have it in that order, why they would mention the certain people they do. Because I'm sure my list is not going to be like other people's lists. They might not consider some of the guys that I would consider personally, at least. Like they might think, say Fitz, like, well, Ruby Rob was great, but, he didn't do a gigantic amount just that one weight. Whereas I might think, well, hey, man, what was he doing when he was that size? Who was he able to beat being himself of that bracket? But who knows? That's so that's the long and short of just basically the first part I wanted to say. I'm going to keep this short. I said that last time I talked for over 2 hours, but that's not going to happen today. But this greatest middleweights list, because, for a lot of people, Monzon, Ray Robinson, Harry Greb, possibly Langford, these guys all make compelling and different arguments. So all these different fighters do, and lots more. There are other guys, someone who weighed like career win-loss record might have other fighters in here too. I mean, this is definitely not the be all and end all. This is just a few pictures I threw up there to talk over. The other thing I want to talk about, so when BL and Scrap myself, when we counted down the top 10 heavyweights, 1900 and 1925, we set no criteria. We showed up, we did the talk, and all three of us had, in some order, Jack Johnson, Harry Wills, and Sam Langford as the top three of that 25-year span. And someone commented, well, I'll put the comment up. Sorry about the cropping. I thought this would crop better. I'll read it though. How all three of you can rate Langford ahead of Wills is absolutely ludicrous. Shout out for the good word, ludicrous. That's a great word. According to Wikipedia, they fought 17 times, including newspaper decisions, with Wills winning 13, 2 by KO and 2 draws. Langford struggled with fighters like Big Bill Tate and Lee Anderson. There's no doubt he was a great overall fighter, but definitely not the greatest heavyweight in that 1900 and 1925 timeframe. Well, that's entirely fair to think, and especially, he's not putting anyone who isn't great. I mean, Harry Wills was a fantastic fighter, and he did have the severe winning record in overall in their encounters between each other. And I wrote a response, to the comment in the YouTube comments, but I'm just going to very briefly take a sip of my coffee, and I'm just going to talk a moment about this. It's like the main reason someone like Langford could rate for that whole time period over Wills, even though Wills got the best of their series, so that they fought. The arcs of their careers only partly overlapped, and their primes barely overlapped. So when they had their encounters, when they first fought, Langford was getting a little bit past it. And then as the series went on, Langford was getting older and older. Now, he was still a great fighter, but he was past his peak. So he could maybe say he was at the end of his prime, by 1915. Certainly 1916, he was getting a little bit past it. In 1917, he was, he lost sight in one eye halfway through the year. So from that point on, if you're Harry Wills, you can be great. Langford can still be one of the best in the world, but he is one-eyed, overweight Sam Langford. He's not the Boston Terror who from when he was in his prime. That's fine. They kept fighting. Langford beat a whole slew of other fighters. So, and Wills had other great wins, and Langford still had great wins after he was clearly past his best, and he was like cycloptic. But that series that the poster was mentioning, most of that happened after Langford he'd already left his peak. And when they initially met, I think they drew, and then Langford beat him, and then I think Wills beat him. Langford beat him back, maybe. I don't know. I can't remember the exact record of their first several encounters. I had it in the comment, but I'd have to go refresh my memory. But looking at like greatness, it wouldn't just be the head-to-head encounters. You could take other fighters. You could find fighters that beat Muhammad Ali or Ezard Charles, who you wouldn't say were greater than them, even if they beat them and it wasn't avenged. Langford did get some on his own. He did get some wins and there was some draws. But I mean, there are examples of even more where someone has 100% success against a fighter who's maybe gone past their best. You wouldn't say, therefore, they are greater than the other guy. Sometimes you can get a fighter when the other guy isn't that far past his best, if at all, and he can beat him and it won't be avenged. And you still wouldn't say it. Like, how many people would put, say, Buster Douglas over Mike Tyson in an all-time heavyweight listing? Buster beat him. He stopped him. But does that make him automatically greater, or do you look at what they each did against everybody? Not just each other, but the whole field. And obviously, in this kind of instance, Langford and Wills had a ridiculous amount of fights against each other. So there's certainly a larger sample size than say, just a one-off fight where the one guy wins, but the other guy has the bigger resume. But with Langford and Wills, they were both incredibly dominant, in their primes, but they barely overlapped their primes. It's just Langford fought way, way past his prime and stayed world class for years after he'd left his absolute best. So it is possible to give Wills credit for those wins along with his other wins, while noting that though still powerful, Langford wasn't at his absolute peak. So Wills didn't really get to fight Langford at his prime. Or certainly if he did, he got to fight it toward the end of the prime, and they were competitive, even though Langford was much smaller and Wills was a career heavyweight. That's another thing that I think throws people about Langford is, well, he had a tremendous amount of fights at heavyweight, but he wasn't a heavyweight for a lot of that time. He could make middleweight or he could make light heavy, but he was fighting heavyweights. He was fighting opponents who could only fight at heavyweight. Wills was a big guy. He was this huge guy. And so, again, so with the term greatness, well, the fact that Langford not only did everything else he did, but managed to get some wins over Wills with that huge size disparity, that would radiate some greatness of its own. Just depends on what people are weighing. But I wanted to read this gentleman's comment without getting outraged or anything like that. It's just it's perfectly fair to have Wills ranked above Langford if you want to. It just comes down to criteria, because I mean, we're just saying greatest. It's just a word. We're not saying, it's not like we're saying who had the most number of wins under this criteria, or who met these specific standards, and then you just weigh the two against each other. We're just talking about the term greatest. They were both really, really great. But Wills really came into his own and dominated after Langford had dominated. He took over for Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh, and Johnson. Wills became the guy, and basically Wills became the guy that the champions were ducking, because he was he was the best of the guys who were getting shafted for title shots. That doesn't necessarily mean over his whole career, because I think Wills started in 1911. Langford started in 1902. I think Will's first really tough fights were he fought the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark, and I can't remember, it was either McVeigh or Jeanette in 1913, I believe. And he fought each of them to a draw. It might have been McVeigh and Clark. Fought them to a draw. Langford's first heavyweight fight, he fought Joe Jeanette in 1905. And they fought, and then he lost, and then he avenged the loss in 1906 and fought and lost to the great Jack Johnson. Well, Langford weighed like 150 something. He's fighting heavyweights back in 05, 06. So his world class, the beginnings of his world class sort of like experience was so many years before Wills really got those big steps up. When he's fighting like Jeff Clark, who was like extremely talented. He wasn't particularly large, but he was extremely good. So fighting Jeanette, McVeigh, Langford, those are great opponents, and they were all just complete killers. But we see plenty of examples of athletes who are great, and they stay great past their prime. They're just not as powerful competitors. It's fair to say someone can still be great when they're not at their absolute peak. You see lots of that. But just not everyone, especially these days when athletes fortunately make more money, we don't as often see people fight past their prime because they don't necessarily have to. But regarding the second part of the comment there, where he said Langford struggled with fighters like Big Bill Tate and Lee Anderson, that's true. But that again, I believe that happened later in his career. So, and separate from, I'm not sure if Anderson had much of a size advantage on him, but Big Bill Tate certainly did. But later in his career, Langford could be beaten. But until you get to, if you look at his year-to-year win-loss record, really it was, up to about the middle of 1906 when he lost to Johnson, lost to young Peter Jackson. And then you go all the way to probably 9 years later. Langford was a titan, even though he was a little guy. Once you get to 1915, 1916, he's getting a little bit past it. He's had a huge number of fights. I think I counted 137 fights. So when Wills first fought Langford had 137 fights worth of wear and tear on his body, professional fights. And some of those were long fights. Those weren't all tiny affairs, fighting. Some of these are 20 rounds. So he'd been through a lot already. And even though he was amazing, that does add up. That happens to lots of fighters. They get a little bit shop worn. They may still be great, but they just don't have quite what they used to, even if they're better than the other people around them. So, part of greatness is overcoming adversity, at least one way to look at it. So I think also, with Langford, he spent his whole career overcoming different kinds of adversity. So later on, when he's moving toward the end of his prime, I can't remember when he first fought Big Bill Tate, but I'm pretty sure that his fights with Lee Anderson happened after he'd lost sight in one eye, after the Fred Fulton destruction in 1917. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that Lee Anderson. So yeah, if you beat one-eyed Sam Langford, that's still a badass win, but it's not the same as beating the Boston Terror, who was, who just struck fear into so many fighters and was much avoided, but then also did fantastically well against the guys who didn't avoid him, the world-class guys that he did get to fight. But I certainly agree with the very end of this comment, which is no doubt he was a great overall fighter. That's enough for me, just if we're showing everyone the respect. But as far as who is the greatest in that time frame, if the poster happens to check this, I would love to see your list, because I'm always interested in how people perceive combat sports. It's sort of the intersection of martial arts and sports and entertainment. So we all have our own ways to measure who the greatest was, but I was certainly fairly comfortable with the upper part of my list, although I still struggle between Wills and Jack Johnson, to be honest. They both had fantastic careers. So the top three, I did have Langford 1, and I went with I believe I went with Johnson for 2 and Wills for 3, but I was debating it with myself even as we got down to the top 3. All very great fighters, but I think Langford, the size of his heavyweight resume and the adversity he overcame, and also that he had so much stopping power. So even ignoring that he was a little guy, he has almost as many knockouts as the great Archie Moore. That's a bunch of knockouts. So I'm very excited to do this top 10 greatest middleweights of all time countdown. And I'm sure that none of our 3 lists will be identical, and we may not even agree on a single spot, because there's so many under that broad term and under floating criteria, meaning we can format it whatever we want. We're not debating. I'm not going to debate Scrap and BL. I'm not trying to get, it's not really that appealing to any of us anyway, but I would certainly lose any kind of debate that depended on boxing history knowledge. But I'm very comfortable just giving my opinion, and that's enough of it. I am researching for this. I'm not just going off the top of my head or trying to think about someone I have to have in my list. I'm just going through and looking at the factors and weighing them all. So that's all I wanted to say. I hope everyone has a fantastic day. And I have some other projects coming up. And I'm recording a podcast with Michael Carbett from thefightcity.com. We do a series of discussions on boxing, on researching boxing. So rather than talking about the research I've been doing, we're actually going to be talking about how do you go about researching? What are the factors? We're going to do a series of discussions there that'll either appear on the website and then possibly longer versions on the site's Patreon page. More to come on that, but that's something we're working on actively. And just Sam Langford, I've been researching for a little while now, the early part of his career, and more generally his whole career, but certainly the early part of his career. And I'm just going to talk about some of the things I discovered, sure, but also the process of going about, separating myth from reality, separating hearsay from reporting, and also judging the different kinds of reporting and the accuracy of different kinds of reporting, and dealing with bias, and how we weigh multiple sources against each other, and which would apply to any sort of historical research that involves archives, written archives, but especially fight history, because there are agendas when we're talking about entertainment as well. So to promote people, certain things are said, but often with a broad search, outlier reporting can be sort of identified as suspect, possibly suspect, simply because there's sort of the narrative that seems to be agreeing with itself, and then there's someone out here saying some whole other thing. So we're going to do that on the between the website and the Patreon. But on here on my YouTube channel, I definitely want to do more boxing history talks, and having BL and Scrapbook join me at all is just such a privilege. This is going to be a tough countdown. This thing's going to be really tough. I'm definitely going to have to put some hours in going through their schedules, but also their opponents' schedules. They're not just the numerical record, but who did their great opponents fight? What did their great opponents do? How many fights they have against them? And more details, like Ray Robinson, like the age at which Langford too, although later in his career Langford couldn't make middleweight, but Ray Robinson, he was doing tremendous work in his mid and late 30s. So that's definitely a factor. But then you also have these guys who went on terrific runs. Some of them cut short, like Stanley Catchell. Some of them limited in size, but uh, buffered with powerful work above that weight, like Bob Fitzsimmons. And some just gigantic middleweight resumes that are coupled with being a middleweight, fighting great light heavyweights, and also some heavyweight contenders like the great Harry Greb. You also got, Bernard Hopkins, people with Metro Boy Jones Jr. God, my goodness, Monzon, like that run he went on when he got to title level, he just stayed there. A lot of people rate that very highly. Not separate from how he looked when he was fighting or finish weight, just the success and competing in the sport in a row. But there's certainly some other criteria that could come in, especially with these guys. I'm not going to tell them how to rate fighters. I actually study boxing librarians, his statistical videos, but also he did heavyweight ratings. I think he did 1900 to 1923 possibly. He did pound for pound rankings, 1890, 1892, 1923, I believe it was. He might have done heavyweight rankings past that point, but I know he did that early era. So I'm actually studying his rankings to try and learn about the texture of the early gloved era. So I'm not going to tell him how to rank the greatest anything of all time. If he wants to go purely on resume, like his automated ratings do from his database, because I suppose he could just go find the career middleweights at, I'm not saying he will, but find the career middleweights in his top 1,000 boxers of all time, automated list, and then put them in order. That would be fair. Anything would be fair. I'm just really looking forward to the discussion. Scrapbook and BL have vast knowledge, and they also have information they can look up. They have access to a lot of info. I've giant, like a wealth of supporting information of what I can find online. So my list might be the least reliable as far as like the amount of information it's based on, but I'll still be putting what people would consider a lot of time into trying to have a credible list that I can defend. But I always learn a lot from these talks, so I'm looking forward to that. We'll have that announced soon. I'll definitely be looking at more lists on Twitter as far as, because a lot of people a lot of boxing fans, especially historical enthusiasts, they like to do lists. They might even change. You might argue with your own list 6 months later. Because a lot of it's what are we thinking of? The terms are so broad that unless we're just making it a math problem, like who had the most of X, like who won the most title fights relative to their losses, or something. If you're not doing that, then it's perfectly subjective. And I prefer that for discussion. Because what do we want to have a discussion on how we can add up numbers, or do we want to have a discussion just on how something appeals to us, like a broad term like greatest? So I'm all for that floating criteria, and I think it's more interesting than if we just, haggle over numbers and things like that. Because, if someone was like, Stanley Catchell was so great, and him dying young doesn't change how I feel about his greatest, I'm like, fine. That's, as long as we're celebrating everyone, giving everyone some degree of respect. If we're saying other people glow brighter in history than others as far as their fighting greatness, well, that's cool. It's part of the fun. It helps us celebrate the greats, keep their memory alive. Even if people are celebrating different greats, we're just keeping people's memory alive. Can't count on to give an honest take on history to fans. I think fans have fallen into the trap on occasion, thinking, well, the promoter, the professionals will give everyone their due credit. Well, that's not true. We see it with today's boxers between promotions, but that also counts historically because of either how it relates to the boxers that they are promoting at the moment, or the lineage of their promotion, or even just, they only bring up people that serve their interests and then everyone else gets forgotten, or they just don't want to kill any kind of buzz for what's happening right now. So they're not going to be like, oh, yeah, look at this, welterweight title fight. These guys are punks compared to Barbados Walcott, but they're pretty cool. I mean, they're not going to say that like because these guys only want to fight people their own size, and Barbados Walcott would jump up in weight and fight much larger guys. So you're not gonna hear about Barbados Walcott very often from a promotion. But so these lists, these discussions, this is what keeps the memory alive, and I want to do my little part in that. I'm certainly thrilled to be discussing, old school boxing history, or in this case, like pan-generational boxing history with BL and Scrap. So I'm there to learn as well as to talk, and it also a lot of our discussions weave into my Sam Langford research as far as things for me to learn, or takes for me to try and comprehend to help with my understanding Langford's career, because he interacted with so many great fighters. So, when we did the top 10 greatest heavyweights, in our opinion, the first quarter century of the 1900s, well, that related to Langford's career. This greatest middleweights, top 10 greatest middleweights countdown that we're going to have coming up, some of the guys that might be in the consideration relate to Langford's career. And, Langford himself might show up on one of those lists. For me personally, like when he was a middleweight, what he was doing as a middleweight sized person was remarkable. And take the other, I love me some Marvin Hagler, but Marvin Hagler versus Sam Mcveigh, I don't know about that. I mean, he never fought like a knockout artist with, I don't even know how many pounds he went out. I'm not sure what Hagler walked around at. He walked around at more than Langford had at times his career, but you want to have him fight a 220-pound knockout artist? I don't know if that's, even at his very best, that's going to be tough. So Langford, as that size person, was doing that. Even Stanley Catchell, although he got brutally knocked out, he knocked Jack Johnson down while he was still a middleweight. So while he was the champion, if I'm not highly mistaken. So pretty crazy stuff. But that doesn't have to be the criteria. Someone could just go on the resume strictly at middleweight, or they could just go by titles. They only want to talk about title fights. Because one of the discussions I saw on Twitter last night was they were discussing, it was framed as the greatest middleweight champions, which is separate from just the greatest middleweights. Because now you're talking about title level work and belts, the accumulation of belts and accolades in that realm. So that would take out someone like, say, like Harry Greb had some, the Walker win especially, but he had some great, he has middleweight he has middleweight title accolades, but they don't represent his whole career, because it was very late and he'd had over 200 fights when he won the middleweight championship. So, he had some fights, some defenses, but it was nothing heavy compared to the rest of his career. He'd done way better. Even if then later he had some good stuff, but he'd already done more than he was able to do there at the end of his career, even as the champ. So that wouldn't be represented. Whereas maybe someone like Monzon, most or all of his work, world-class work, was involved with titles, or at least while he was holding the belt. 'Cause, these guys like Ray Robinson too. These guys sometimes when they're holding the title, they might win a bunch of fights, but they're not all title fights. Other guys, they just do a string of title fights. So that's going to factor in as well. And I'm excited because I did a video series trying to predict the updated version of BL's top 1,000, boxers of all time. Well, I tried to predict the top 15 and ended up trying to predict the top, I believe, 20 when we actually did the live chat recap. But, so I like so in my mind, I'm trying to think of what they might come up with for their lists, especially as I need to try and have graphics prepared for everyone who's going to come up beforehand. I can't make them while we're in StreamYard. It'll just, if I exit out of the browser, it'll end the chat. So certainly I'm trying to predict at least a pool of, say, 40 middleweights, 40 graphics that I can prepare that'll cover the possible top 10s between my top 10 and their top 10s. But I might still not get some in. I did quite a few for the heavyweight countdown, and there were still a few guys that came up and I didn't have a graphic loaded. sometimes because it wouldn't load. I was having some difficulties technically, but also there was a guy I hadn't even thought of that Scrapbook had in his list, and I was like, oh my goodness. That's how it goes. I just excited to, to delve into history and just explore the texture. But I can tell you that I can say this with absolute assurance, regardless of what anyone thinks. For me, like Harry Greb is in that pool. He's going to be in my top 10. Where? I'm not going to say. But based on what I already know and my sense of it, I guarantee he's showing up in my top 10. And there's a great argument for him as way, way up the top 10 list. Not necessarily number one, though. It's a storied division. But I don't intend to just go on resume, and I'm not gonna only look at title fights, because that would be ridiculous. Because Greb did more in his career before he won a world title than almost all the other guys that might make a middleweight list, across all weight classes, did in their whole career, start to finish. Not Langford, but the size of his resume, by the time he won the world title, yeah, that gave him some official accolades, but he'd already given Gene Tunney his only career loss. Yeah, sure, it was for the America's light heavyweight title. Tunney did avenge the loss, and they also fought the draws, but that was Tunney's only career loss in a great career that he had. So, would I rate Harry Greb's win over Johnny Wilson to win the title over him giving Tunney his only loss? No, not in the slightest. No way. That's not a diss on Johnny Wilson. It's just that, sorry, bro, you're not Gene Tunney. You didn't have that career, so giving you a loss is not the same. It's not the same. But it's definitely, and just to briefly once more mention the comment that I came on also to address, heads up encounters is not the only, it's not adequate to judge fighters against each other, because all other things aren't equal. And definitely when people fight in their careers, so like, would Lee Anderson beat 1912 Sam Langford? Like, if you took Lee Anderson when he fought Langford, like late in Langford's career, past his prime, if you take him back in time and have him fight 1912 Sam Langford, 1911 Sam Langford, does he win that fight? Or is he one more guy getting knocked out? And possibly the same with Big Bill Tate, although he was a big fella. He was durable, but not everyone, so you can't just say, look how they fought each other. This guy's greater than this guy. It's like, well, what else did they do? And what was the context of their encounters? Because certainly, if you take you say all of like Ezzard Charles's losses, well, there aren't that many guys you can even seriously consider putting above him when you look at Ezzard Charles' career achievements. I don't just mean title achievements, although, because he was put off for titles, ended up getting it at heavyweight, but he was put off for titles at other weights. But he has 20 wins over Hall of Famers. So if somebody, I don't care if you do beat Ezzard Charles, if that's the base for the whole thing, well, what did he do in his career? So if I'm ranking the greatness, he's going over guys who may have beaten him because of what he did in his career. In some, that's the same thing with Langford, because Langford later in his career, yes, some guys got the best of him. Fred Fulton got him. But if you look at what Fred Fulton's whole CV and his whole resume contains, and then you compare it to Langford, it's not the same. Even if he beat a prime Sam Langford one of those times, it wouldn't match up. It's just not enough. Certain guys do so much. And that's true of a lot of boxers. Maybe I should do up some graphics for that. But right now I'm just focusing on preparing for this talk, this epic talk. And it's probably going to be a beast. I think it's going to end up being like 2 or 3 hours, which might be painful for some listeners, but I love these things. I learn so much. It's just nice to talk to these guys. They have a great passion for pugilism, and they show a lot of respect. And I think that's important, show respect for just talking about martial arts, talking about competition. These guys are all great. Even someone who there are great fighters who wouldn't even make, say, a top 20 all-time middleweights list, but they're great anyway. A lot of greatness. There's so many years of it. And in mixed martial arts, which is much more recent phenomenon, at least in an organized format, a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, they count the start of the UFC as sort of like their rough starting point, without getting into that too much. But if you do that for like gloved, 4-ounce gloves, like certain framework, that's only 1993. And there are lots of great fighters who've fought in MMA already, just since 1993. And you can go back before in Brazilian Vale Tudo and other stuff, but just starting at that point, there are lots of great fighters already. So making a greatest fighters list in MMA, which is a much shallower, much more recent phenomenon, is tough. So now we're talking about middleweight boxers, or boxers who were middleweights at times. We're talking, 100. I don't know if any of us would be looking at guys like Nonpareil, Jack Dempsey, or anyone from like too deep into the 1800s. So maybe 1880s, 1890s, all the way to today. That's a big span of time. So many fighters. And we're going to try and boil it down to 10. So please, and I'll ask in advance, please forgive if my list seems goofy. I'll try to explain my criteria, why certain people made my list and maybe others didn't. But, really, I'm going to be learning from BL and Scrap. And it's a great opportunity to just celebrate some different guys. So I was just going to do a short talk. This is a little 45, 46-minute talk. I guess I'm very long-winded. I hope everyone's having a great day. Thanks for listening. If you made it this far, congratulations. If you have your own list, by all means, put it in the comment. I've got the video. Within a day or two, I'll put the stream up on my channel, the video for the stream. You can always put in the comments if you have your own opinions on the top middleweights. Feel free to chime in, even though I'm going to have to, I'll just set it for a few weeks off and then adjust it when we announce the official date. But I'll put it up there in case anyone wants to comment. And thanks for listening, and really, really have a good day today. Radiate your own greatness. All right, take care. Oh, hold on. I was about to sign off. Oh, what's up, Scrap? Good morning, sir. Okay. I was about to sign off, but I see you there, man. I got to show some respect. I'm really looking forward to this middleweight countdown. See these monsters I got up here, Scrap? Look at this. Robinson, Hagler, Ketchel, Walker, Greb, Hopkins, Fitz, Monzone, Beggin Sam. Holy crap. There's some candidates, right? Just incredible. And so many, what I was saying earlier, Scrap, was, I don't know if you caught the whole thing or if, but I was talking about, like, there are so many different, like, why we didn't set a criteria, why we just have like a floating criteria. Why it's more interesting is because we're having a discussion. We're not debating. We're not trying to argue or prove each other wrong. We're just having a discussion about what greatness means to us and then we just put them in order. Okay, but there are so many different arguments. Like I was saying, like Ray Robinson, he recaptured titles and he fought way late into his prime. I mean, way late past his prime, his late 30s, early 40s, he's fighting at title level, world-class level in a rich era. And so some people would rate that kind of greatness highly. Like same with Muhammad Ali, at heavyweight, they lose, but then they come back. They suffer setbacks and they overcome that adversity, and they're fighting late in their careers and they're still doing great things. But then you have guys like, Hagler, Hopkins, Monzone, who had a lot of success in a row, a lot of it at title level. They kind of stayed at title level. Then you have guys like Stanley Ketchel, who was fantastic, even knocked down Jack Johnson before, obviously before he got knocked out in return, but a great middleweight who sadly died young, died in his early 20s. So he didn't get to do everything, but he was great. In his day, he was great. And so even though he didn't get to express his full career, he he had a list. Yeah, and to be clear, Scrap, this is just some of the guys I have in my pool. That's not the order I have them. I just threw them up. That's why I actually came on the stream 10 minutes after 7 instead of at 7. I was I was making this graphic. But these guys were all factors to me. These are certainly guys in consideration. Then I was saying like Mickey Walker, so powerful welterweight, but then he moved up, became a powerful middleweight, and then fought up the weights, even fought at heavyweight. So I mean that's great. He aimed high. You just came on, yeah, so good. So yeah, I'm just giving a little recap. It's great to see you. I was going to sign off, but I'll talk for a while, man. I love to talk about history and boxing history, and especially getting your feedback. This countdown's going to be a beast. Well, I know BL, I'm sure is aware of that too. Then you have like Harry Greb, where he checks a lot of boxes too. If you just look at middleweight wins, my goodness, what a gigantic list of accomplishments as far as who he was able to beat. But then also, who was he able to beat above middleweight when he was still a middleweight? He didn't beef up to go up. He just fought a larger man, but he was still a middleweight. And the size of his resume, so I mean, the argument for him is very compelling. Darren Hopkins, stayed ranked for so long. He was ranked, at the top of, weight classes for so many years. And not only was incredibly successful, but he also overcame adversity. He also came back and fought way past his prime. So that's pretty darn great by certainly many different measures. Then you have Fitz. Fitz wasn't a big guy. He fought all the way up to heavyweight. So those three kind of like, we're definitely going to have different lists, but I imagine we're going to have a lot of, maybe not the same order like our other countdown, Scrap. We're going to have similar lists, perhaps, at least toward the top. Well, actually, or somewhere in there. But the order is not going to, it's impossible. There's too many versions of great. The word great can mean so many different things. But yes, I agree with that. We will have great reasons for the pick, and that's the fun, educated part. Yeah, and I'm not trying to debate you guys. Why would I want to insult you or any of the listeners by being like, well, I want to debate these guys who they're top. It's a discussion. So criteria, no criteria. Because part of the discussion, just like our last one, Scrap, the first thing I'm gonna do is ask you and BL, hey, what do you think of when what does greatness mean to you? And then you can answer either in the context of the middleweight countdown or just in general. But that's what I'm there to learn. I wanna understand better the history, and to do that I have to just keep studying and be able to have my own opinions, but also realize that like I'm still learning. And there's some great middleweights by other measures that I did not put up here. I almost tried to go find a picture of Tommy Ryan, who checks off a lot of boxes himself, but he also has some arguments against as far as inside 10. But as far as an early era great, Jack O'Brien, Tommy Ryan, there are guys that Nonpareil, Jack Dempsey, there are guys I didn't put in. Yeah, absolutely, Scrap. I second that. No debate. Would never do that. All fun with education. Certainly, I mean, I like to debate in general, but I don't debate out of my depth. I'm not gonna or debate something I don't have strong opinions on. Like as far as like what greatness means, or the only strong opinion I have is that it's hard to set criteria, and it means different things to different people. That's the only. So I would debate whether or not. The only debate I would have over greatness is whether or not someone could define greatness in absolute terms, which is impossible. That's the only thing I would argue. I'd never try and come in with the boxing knowledge, and I really appreciate just having these discussions. Like the Greb discussion, the Harry Greb's top 5 toughest years we did, that was so much fun. So hearing you and BL just talk about why those years were, why they stood out to you amongst all these years, because I'm impressed by all of it. The fact that people fight, that compete in a sport this tough, I'm impressed by all of it. So different versions of greatness that people are looking for, it's all good with me. I saw a list on Twitter yesterday that I had to blink a few times at, and then I was just like, well, hold on a minute. That's just how that guy felt. It wasn't about middleweights, but it was about pound for pound all time. It was dramatically different to the ones I'd seen, but I'm not going to hate on anyone, because what's the worst thing is to ignore great fighters, not championing some great fighters over others. The worst thing you can do for combat sports is to ignore great fighters, because then their memory fades. Like I was saying before you came on, Scrap, we can't trust promotions to keep everyone's memory alive in proportion to their greatness, because they have agendas. They've got businesses to run, and that they don't really have any interest in talking about how great stuff that they don't promote now, that isn't happening now, because what does that help them sell? Unless they can relate it back to those athletes, it's just pointing out how much more other people did. If you're talking about boxing, because there's some of these resumes, the guys today, it's hard for them to keep up. Just because they don't fight as often, they don't have as many fights in their primes. I think we mentioned that on the last BO was talking about it, and yourself on the heavyweight countdown we did 1900, 1925. The amount of fights someone has during their prime. Well, if you're not fighting a busy schedule, you have less opportunities to express your greatness while you're at your best. Sometimes through an activity, or like with Stanley Catchell on the left there, because he passed away when he was young. So that doesn't mean that anyone should give him credit for things he didn't do, but it's possible, if we're just talking about greatness, for someone to recognize how great they were while recognizing that they, while admitting they got cut short. Marcel Sedan, I believe, is another one, right? Cut short. Not everyone gets to stay around, whether it's injury or sometimes you just don't know. Like Gerald McClellan, even, he had the tragic fight with Ben, which until it all went wrong for him, it was a fantastic fight, if I'm allowed to say that. But so hard to know what people would go on to do. But or like, also I didn't have him I forgot to put him in this graphics. I cobbled this together real quick, but Roy Jones Jr., a lot of people would talk about how good he was, separate from the size of someone's work at a weight or anything like that. They might just go by the eye test. I mean, if that's how they want to do it. He has a resume to back it up too, but also just how good he was, how fast he was, to be like, yo, 5 left hooks, man. Showing him the right, knocking him out with the left. He was brilliant. So if that makes the criteria, if Roy or these other guys show up on the list, I'm down to listen to the reasons why, especially from you guys. I'm here to learn. But it's tough, and there was a comment someone had made, Scrap, on our I got to pull up the other brand. Hold on, go to the other section. Someone posted a comment on our heavyweights countdown, and it was I'll post it up. They were basically just saying that it was kind of, they thought to them it felt ridiculous that we had Langford ranked over Wills for that 1900 1925 period, because they fought so many times, but then Wills won most of them. And they'd also mentioned Langford struggled with guys like Big Bill Tate and Lee Anderson. So, he gave him credit for a great overall fighter, but he was just saying that in his opinion, Langford was definitely not the greatest heavyweight in that time frame. And I was saying, I guess that's fair. I mean, if he feels that way, but it's also fair to note that, Langford debuted in 1902 and fought his first great heavyweight in 1905. He fought Jeanette. Wills debuted in 1911. He fought Jeff Clark, and I can't remember. It was either, I think it was Jeff Clark and McVeigh. It was that or Jeff Clark and Jeanette in like 13. So there was a big gap. There was that big, 8 years difference in when they first started fighting heavyweight. So the fact that Wills got the better of Langford in the series, is partly because Langford was leaving his prime. He was leaving his prime a few fights into their series. So even though he remained world class, Wills was also world class and better and bigger and in his prime. Langford was leaving his prime, even though he was still beating a tremendous amount of other people. Scrapbook says, that's why I always say you must judge a fighter in the time in which he or she came. Absolutely, Scrap. Truer words were never spoken. Criteria differ from era to era. That's right, because you can't, like, it's hard to make a direct, like, to find some framework where you can compare Harry Greb to, say, Monzon, because the texture of their career is so different. Like, you can't just rattle off Harry Greb's, like, title accomplishments without leaving out many, 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 many great fights, great wins over Hall of Famers, because of how late in his career he got his title. And how he fought a multiple of, he probably fought, what, more than 3 times. How many fights did Monzon have? I'm trying to remember. But he had well over 2 times the amount of fights that Monzon had in his whole career before he got to a title. So Greb's resume is underrepresented in his title work, although the win over Mickey Walker was a great win, but he had so many great wins before then. So how'd you compare the two? Well, I guess that's where you come down to the floating criteria, right? What's up, Antonio Mosley? Yeah, Scrap, that's the truth. Laws, gloves, rules, right? You have to sort of interpret it. Even if someone holds one higher than the other. Ladies and gentlemen, this is fantastic news. I'd like to announce we have a surprise special guest, an honored guest. BL, welcome, my friend. Good afternoon.
Hello there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah, I got your notification you were going live, and I've read the gentleman's comment. Now, I kind of agree with Scrapbook. You know, what we do is not a real life or death debate. Okay, we make our choices based on whatever criteria we wish to use, and we apply that to pick our fighters. And ultimately, that's what it's about. It's like Scrapbook says, it's more about education, and also the fact you get us 3 guys on there choosing that is actually a good thing, because you hear different points of view on certain things. As for the gent's comments, looking at it, he says it's absolutely ludicrous, but I think it's ludicrous to judge how great a fighter is based on individual results against one fighter, because he says there, well, Langford struggled with fighters like Big Bill Tate and Lee Anderson, but Langford were past his prime. You know, Harry Wills does not have as many wins against Sam Mcveigh as Langford does. Harry Wills does not have the number of wins against Joe Jeanette that Langford does. You know, Harry Wills beat Jeff Clark a number of times when Jeff Clark was more past his prime. Langford was also beat Jeff Clark, Jeff Clark a whole number of times. You know, Langford also beat many of the fighters that Harry Wills beat. You know, Wills is a 3-time coloured champion. Langford is a 5-time coloured heavyweight champion. You know, Wills made 25 coloured heavyweight title defences. Langford made just over 40. Langford has nearly 60 coloured heavyweight title fights, while he has over 50 coloured heavyweight title fights. So, you know, when someone uses that terminology, absolutely ludicrous, to me, it's absolutely ludicrous that someone would question someone's, you know, decision based on one small factor and then ignore the entire body of work that Langford did, which is still way bigger than Wills's body of work at heavyweight. Wills may have got the better, beating an older Langford a whole number of times, but in the early fights, it was to and fro. You know, yeah, Wills gained advantage because he came into his prime from that 1917 to 1922 run. Wills were imperious. You know, he was destroying pretty much everybody, from Ole Anderson's, Denver Ed Martins, Gumbos, Fulton's, you know, Jeff Clark's. He was just beating everybody down. But, you know, that's a Wills in his prime in a massive unbeaten run that spanned a number of years, you know, fighting and defending coloured heavyweight title. But ultimately, at the end of the day, despite someone saying it can be ludicrous, Langford has a bigger heavyweight resume. He's more accomplished for coloured titles, fought for them way more. He has way more big wins at heavyweight than Harry Wills does. So even though this gentleman thinks it's ludicrous, I think it's ludicrous to not compare all that other information and just judge it on one small facet. Well, a big facet, the head-to-heads, but not judging, well, how many other great fighters did they fight at heavyweight? How many quality wins do they have at heavyweight? You know, what is the coloured heavyweight title record at heavyweight compared to each other? And in all of those other areas, overall opposition, quality of top elite wins, coloured heavyweight title, like resume, Langford beats Wills on all of them. The only thing Langford doesn't beat Wills on is on the head-to-head, due to Langford leaving his prime from 1916 on, pretty much 1917, and Wills coming into his prime around 1916, 1917. Like I've said before, it was a bad clash of times for Langford, but he still got in there. He still gave Wills some hard fights. Other fights later on in series, Wills were winning more easily, but ultimately Langford still has 2 knockout wins over him as well, so, and could still bully him around in those early fights. So I think the gentleman saying it's ludicrous is a bit harsh. I think it's ludicrous that you can rate a fighter based on that one aspect and ignore all the other aspects that Langford buries Harry Wills on, I'm afraid to say.
Yes, sir. And I think I tried to be generous about it, like, because, you know, I'm when he says Langford's a great fighter, I'm like, all right, so he got the basic down, which is that we don't try to attack the fact of whether someone is great. But I think also he mentioned Wikipedia, so perhaps it's a fan who's used to looking up fighters and seeing maybe they have 1 or 2 fights against each other, and you see who wins. You go, well, this guy was better than this guy if they fought in their primes, and maybe he translated that over to, you know, when someone says Wikipedia, I'm thinking, okay, so the first thing they go to Wiki rather than say BoxRec or Cyberboxing. They may be on a more casual familiarity with this era. And so I basically, in my mind, in my tiny mind, I inserted some words into the comment where it was basically like, it feels ludicrous rather than him trying to make a definitive statement. And try to understand it from someone who may not be familiar with these careers. Maybe that's over generous, but certainly I'm always happy for feedback on our videos. But I do think the head-to-head. So you can help me with this. So who are some guys who beat Ezzard Charles who would be rated under him because he has 20 Hall of Fame level wins and they maybe only have Ezzard Charles or a couple? You know, there are plenty of guys.
Jersey Joe Walcott.
Same with Muhammad Ali and Ray Robinson. They lost.
Oh no, they won 2 apiece. They won 2 apiece. He beat Charlie Bailey twice. He beat Archie Moore 3 times. Beat Maxine. Harold Johnson.
Great point.
Harold Johnson, I don't rate over Ezzard Charles, but he clearly showed he were more than a match for Charles's level in the ring. But yeah, I don't rate him above Ezzard Charles all time. Even though Harold Johnson was a great fighter with that great jab, you know, we know how good a fighter he was, but I don't rate him above Ezzard Charles. You know, it's kind of a strange thing. Just like I don't rate Archie Moore above Ezzard Charles because he could beat Harold Johnson easier than Ezzard Charles could, even though Ezzard Charles beat Moore 3 times. So, you know, I think when people use individual fight results against certain opponents to judge how great a fighter is based over their entire resume away, I think that's a very dangerous way of looking at it, because you are conveniently leaving out lots of other information like I went through. You know, Langford's heavyweight resume, when I get around to doing that video, comparing Langford's heavyweight resume against Joe Louis, people and only heavyweight fights, only Langford's heavyweight fights, you know, people are going to have to make a decision at the end of that video about whether Joe Louis's world title really makes him greater, because the resume comparison is going to be hard for Joe Louis to match. You know, I'm doing that video for this kind of thing. People underrate what Langford did at heavyweight. You know, he beat most of the fighters that Wills beat. He beat some of them easier than Wills beat. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also, you could, I was thinking, well, what if we related it to a more modern boxer where who the casual fan might be more excited about? So like if you asked a fan, okay, who do you rate higher all time? Mike Tyson or Buster Douglas? If you said exactly. Buster Douglas finished Mike Tyson, and he kind of schooled him that night. I mean, it was competitive, but he ended up schooling him and knocking him out with an iconic, you know, really beat him up. But I don't think even the most casual fan or anyone would rate Buster Douglas over Mike Tyson, even though he had 100% win rate.
Yeah, yeah. And another one is it Jorge Castro, Argentinian fighter, and Roberto Duran. So is Jorge Castro greater than Roberto Duran? You know,
That's a great point.
you can't judge a fighter like that. You know, it's something I've said on my channel, Random, and I'm sure Scott Buck will agree that if you're looking at heavyweight, you have to judge the entire heavyweight resume. If you're looking across weight, like pound for pound, you've got to judge the entire career. You can't. To me, I find it ludicrous that people seem to be able to rate fighters based on one aspect, but don't seem to consider everything else that forms the buildup of their whole resume. You know, like I've seen people who say, "Oh, well, Roberto Duran's not a great fighter because he didn't do as well at middleweight as at lightweight." And I'm like, well, does that matter? He did that work at lightweight. He also bet the ring lineal champion Sugar Ray Leonard at welterweight, the best welterweight in the world at that time. So because he didn't do as well at middleweight or super middleweight as you'd hoped, he's suddenly not a great fighter for that. It seems a bit. I've heard so many strange ways of rating fighters. And that's why I enjoyed your recent live when you were talking about what makes a great fighter, you know, and people's interpretation of that. Because ultimately, you know, this gentle Ray, I can't really comment on him, you know, I don't know him, but he's obviously looking at more of a head-to-head based on who should be the greater fighter. But, you know, me, you and Scrapbook will have some similar criteria. We'll have some different criteria, and we'll all have some similar or different criteria to him. And I think one of the things on YouTube that always gets me is people expect you to rate fighters how they think you should rate them, but they never have the counterbalance of saying, well, I will accept that you have different criteria to me. You see, if you rate fighters in any division or in any way or all time, you'll always be picked apart by people who comment saying, well, because of this, you should rate him differently, or this guy shouldn't be that high, or this guy should be higher. But they never give the credit of saying, well, you have your own criteria, so maybe you see it different to me. You know, it's always very one-sided. I've you know, seen a lot on YouTube, and you know, I've come to a conclusion that I rate my way. I will factor Langford's entire heavyweight resume. You know, the toughest fights that Will's had, you know, fighters like Clark and Jeanette and McVeigh, etc. The opponents, the common opponents, Langford did just as well. And like I said, against them Hall of Fame heavyweights like McVeigh and Jeanette, Langford has way more wins than Will's. I mean, Will's only got 2 draws for Jeanette early on. He couldn't beat Jeanette until much later. A number of years later, when Jeanette was way past his prime, before Harry Wills could even beat Jeanette. Langford could beat Jeanette in Jeanette's prime, when Jeanette were at his physical best. So can we also say that, well, it's ludicrous to compare Wills to Langford, you know, as a counterbalance? Well, we can't compare Wills to Langford because he couldn't beat a more prime Jeanette, but Langford could beat prime Jeanette a whole number of times. You know, it's a similar thing, but reversed. You know, but he hasn't considered that, you see.
Yeah, I was trying to remember earlier. I came on the stream. I didn't have any stats loaded or anything, but so like Wills debuted in 1911. He fought a draw with Jeff Clark, and it was either Jeanette or McVeigh in, I think, 1913. I'm trying to remember. That was like
I think it might have been Jeanette. Didn't he fight McVeigh in 1914? Langford 1914.
Right, and he drew with Langford, and if I'm remembering, he drew with Langford and lost to him before he actually beat him.
So, yeah, this is what I mean. This is what I always say. The early fights are split. The first 5 fights, I think, were 2 Langford, 2 Wills, 1 draw. That is an even Steven.
So I think they drew, if I'm remembering, I looked it up earlier, but I've been up all night. I looked it up yesterday, but I think they drew in 1913. Then in 1914, Langford beat him. Then in 15, yeah, that's right. They might have gone 1-1, and then I'm sorry. Then he beat him in 15, and then in 1916, Wills won 3 times. Langford won 1 of them.
And then Langford knocked Wills out the second time. Won it in
19 rounds.
Yeah. Won it in 1917.
Yeah, 19. Yeah. And you know, Wills, even though he was fighting Langford toward the end of his prime, you know, their primes barely overlapped. I mean, it was literally like a year, maybe 2 years, and that's even being generous because Wills got better and better. So he peaked. He probably peaked. You said 1970. See, I think of him coming into his own maybe 14 or 15, but really hitting his peak was after that. And
Yeah,
Langford
around
was
1917. And then while 1922, he had a virtual almost 50-fight unbeaten run where he was
goodness
destroying
me.
everything inside. I think until losing to Bill Tate when he suffered, I think it was fracture in his left wrist, if I recall, or in his left arm. Trying to remember, but until that Bill Tate loss, I mean, he'd been imperious. He did his stride, and he were on a massive multi-year unbeaten run. He was destroying people left, and I mean destroying people. But you know that was after Langford had left his prime, and during those same years, 1917 to 22, you know, Wills fought Langford a number of times, and he was better in them. But you know, Wills were a big heavyweight in his prime. You know, on a great win run. You know, massively confident. Langford bulked up overweight. He was sometimes hitting near 200 pounds, not the like 170, you know, 175, 165 in his prime at heavyweight. You know, he was heavier, he was slower, he was past his prime, his eyesight was, you know, starting to go, he was starting to suffer effects of his long ring career. So, you know, if he wants to judge Harry Wills as a great heavyweight based on beating an opponent for the most part past his prime, then that's up to him. But I judge the entire heavyweight resume because I think to rate in any division, like I've always said, you know, you have to factor the entire heavyweight resume. And I think Langford has more, he has way more Hall of Fame heavyweight wins than Wills. He has way more success for a coloured heavyweight title, made way more defences. And many of those toughest opponents that Wills fought, like I said, Clark, Jeanette and McVeigh, Langford has way more wins against them. So
yeah, absolutely. And sorry, my wife called from upstairs. I cut out for a second. I heard all but the last 2 seconds. Yeah, and I think you know, like there's so many examples now that pop into my head. Like say Bill Lang, right? Bill Lang beat Bob Fitzsimmons, but did he beat capital letters Bob Fitzsimmons, or did he beat
no, I know he didn't.
long past his best? Because Langford smashed Bill Lang when Lang was still as good as he was going to get. But you know, and so like when somebody fights, it's just in a long series like that. Because Langford was so good past his best, that those wins on Will's part still meant a lot. He was still one of the best, but he was no longer the best. Wills basically proved himself one of the top two of that era that followed. You know, it was him and whoever the champ was ducking him, Willard and Dempsey. But Wills was the guy there, and he was doing the work. But that doesn't mean, you know, like these guys had storied careers. So like the year, let me pull up my graphic. So the year that Harry Wills made his professional debut with no notable fights, this is the combined record of Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh that same year. So Wills fought no one. They fought each other. They fought everyone else. And that's just 1 year. So like Langford, the first time I think I counted 137 fight veteran was what Wills fought when he fought Langford. Langford had 137 fights and however many off the books, wear and tear on his body when they first met, and they fought to a draw. And Langford was smaller, so, you know, no diss on Wills, but, you know, he didn't really face the fierce, the absolute prime Langford, whereas McVeigh and Jeanette definitely did, and all of Langford's other victims that got a taste of his prime, he was something extra because he had his speed and mobility, you know. Well, you know.
He's kind of like Muhammad Ali and Leon Spinks. That's another example. Could I, to anyone who says, well, Will's better, so Will should be greater than Langford based on his head-to-head results. So can I say that Leon Spinks is on the same level as Muhammad Ali because he was 1 win, 1 loss and therefore matched Ali? So therefore, could I say, well, Leon Spinks is on Ali's level because he's 1 win, 1 loss. Ali didn't win a fight series against him. You see, I think it's always dangerous when people rate fighters that way because, like with the Ali Spinks, I couldn't say in the top 10, well, I have them tied. I've got them tied at number 2 because, you know, they're both won and lost against each other. You can't really rate like that. You can't rate like that because then when you go, right, what else did they do? Muhammad Ali crushes Leon Spinks like a bug under your shoe. So you can't use the head-to-head results to say Leon Spinks is clearly on Muhammad Ali's level because it's 1-1. Ali wasn't superior. It's the same kind of methodology, you see, but it doesn't work in boxing. I find you have to look at the resume ultimately.
Yeah, and it gets really complicated if you switch in between a single division and pound for pound. So like Ezra Charles, I would rate him over Joe Louis pound for pound. But even
Yes,
though
I would too.
but even though he beat Joe Louis head to head, that was an older Joe Louis, and I would rate Joe Louis as a greater heavyweight, strictly at heavyweight, than Ezard Charles, even though he lost to him.
Even though
Because
he
it's
lost to Charles at heavyweight for lineal heavyweight title. So
exactly
there's
because
another example.
he was older. So did Ezard Charles beat capital J Joe Louis? No, he
No,
didn't
he
get
didn't.
to. It didn't time out that way. Same with Ray Robinson. I was looking at his record right before I jumped on. A couple of those late losses, I never even heard of the opponent. And I'm not super casual, but I'm certainly I'm no expert, but I'm also not super casual. And a couple of guys, I was like, well, I don't even know who that is. They didn't even have a Wikipedia page, but they got a win because some of these great fighters like Robinson, like Ezra Charles, like Langford, well, Greb was an anomaly. I mean, he was so successful even when he had no business winning fights, but somewhat Langford as well, though he lost more fights toward the end, but they lost to guys who could either game plan around them or were just better than them on the day or better at that point in their career, but they didn't fight. Part of the reason I rate, all those guys in my top 10 all time is because they all fought tremendous levels of competition, but amongst them, I have Langford coming out on top. But between Wills and Johnson, we struggled in our countdown, right? Where the three of us were trying to figure out whether or not Wills or Johnson were 3-2 or 2-3, respectively.
Yeah, it was tough, was that, to be honest, it was tough.
Right. And it's not an insult. We're still talking about, 26 years, I guess we did 1900 to 25, 26 years of in an incredibly rich era in the marquee division. We're trying to narrow it down to 10 people. So if we're haggling between the top three, we're talking about all-time great fighters. So it's no insult to anyone, but I do think people pick the criteria that serves them. Like this
That's
graphic
right,
I have,
yeah.
this graphic I have here. These are lots of different kinds of greatness represented here.
You see, if I may, Antonio Mosley's comment there. Antonio Mosley's a great commenter as well. Antonio Mosley said there, did Denny Moyer beat a Sugar Ray Robinson or did he beat the Sugar Ray Robinson? And that comment kind of mirrors a perfect example of what you were talking about, Random, just then, is a quote I've quoted before, Teddy Downs, who beat Sugar Ray Robinson. Teddy Downs were a middleweight champion in Robinson's time. But when he beat Robinson, when Robinson were having to be given oxygen and all kinds of things in corner, it were a mess. After the fight that Teddy Downs won, that quote of Antonio Mosley is almost carbon copy of what Teddy Downs was asked, because when Teddy Downs left Ring, a reporter said, "Hey, Teddy, you beat Sugar Ray Robinson. How do you feel?" And Teddy Downs said, "Well, I beat Sugar Ray Robinson, but I didn't beat the Sugar Ray Robinson." And that encapsulates exactly what we're talking about. Wills did score a few wins over a more prime Langford, but Langford also could beat him. It was more evenly matched. Langford could even bully him, but later on, he wasn't beating the Sam Langford. And that's what Antonio Mosley says there, perfectly captures that essence.
Yeah, absolutely. And Antonio also says, look at Max Schmeling, Joe Louis, 1-1. Same with Scrapbook. Same with Rocky Castellani.
Yeah, Rocky Castellani. Yeah.
And I can even give an example closer to my heart, which I have to swallow my ego. But I've told you, Joe Calzaghe's my favorite modern era boxer. Not my greatest, my favorite. He beat Hopkins and Roy Jones Jr., but all time I'd rate them over him.
Exactly. Me too. Exactly. And someone may say, "Oh yeah, but Will spent Langford more times than one." It doesn't matter. It's the same principle. Head-to-head fight results. And you can't. To me, it's a very faulty way of rating fighters on head-to-head fight results, because I'm sure Scrapbook, and I'm sure you'll agree, Random, as well, and Antonio. When you're rating fighters loosely on that, looking at their career to rate them, because I wasn't using any of my automated criteria, I was using my criteria in my head and my knowledge on these guys. And you've got to factor this past prime thing. You can't, like you said with Calzaghe, you can't say Joe Calzaghe bet the best version of Roy Jones Jr. I mean, that is ludicrous. Roy Jones was nowhere near his best as when he campaigned with about 8 different variant alphabet straps at light heavyweight. I mean, totally not the same animal. And that, you know, people can factor that if they wish. You know, it has to be factored. And most of Wills's wins over Langford were a past prime Langford.
Yeah, and actually, with Hopkins as well, like Calzaghe beat Hopkins, and Hopkins was still a world-class fighter, but he may not have been at his absolute best. He was older. He was fighting past his physical prime, at least. I mean, he was a special fighter. He was very competitive, like extraordinarily late. But it doesn't, just because you win the encounter or even several encounters, because Langford fought. When Sam Langford has one eye and he's already a small guy for heavyweight, he's still fighting heavyweights. So say Big Bill Tate gives him problems. Well, Big Bill Tate was a giant compared to Sam Langford, even when Langford was
6'5", yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a cartoonishly large mismatch. But if Big Bill Tate fought 1911 Sam Langford, he'd probably end up in the hospital.
Yeah, he probably would. He'd be knocked out cold. Yeah.
Because at that time Langford was so fast, and he had that wonderful finishing move he could use on the real tough guys, where he'd soften them up with straights to the body, and once they were looking for that right hand, he'd feint the right and come upstairs with the left. And that was it's one of the greatest punches any boxer ever possessed, was Langford's left hook.
He took Wills out with one of those, and he took Flowers out with one of those as well.
And Jim Flynn, one of the Flynn knockouts, I believe, was like that. He caught Bill Lang with a few of those. Like he could throw long punches, but on the inside, those short punches, the uppercuts. He had so many ways to knock guys out. It was just phenomenal. But that doesn't, that isn't why he's greater than other fighters. It's what he did against everybody. It's not head to head. It's that you take everybody's head to heads across their career, and who are those people on the other side, and how did everything go? Because otherwise you end up in those impossible triangles, and quadrangles, like you were saying with who was it? It was Ezra Charles, Archie Moore, and
Harold Johnson,
where you end up in an impossible position where there is no, you're just going in circles. And to some degree, Langford, because he fought so many of these long series, like they're all complex. I mean, some of the series he just was the better guy, or they broke even, like fighting the gigantic, battling Jim Johnson, who probably never existed because there've never been big heavyweights, right? Battling Jim.
Yeah, 6'3" and up to 240 pounds sometimes. I mean, he was a massive guy. He was durable. He wasn't a skilled fighter, but he was durable, he was strong, and he was big. So, you could have very physically demanding fights with him. He'd come inside a lot, tie you up, push you around, lean on you, try and sap your strength. You could, he extended lots of elite fighters' rounds, including many of these guys we're talking about.
Exactly. That footage of him and McVeigh, they're in a little ring, but they are throwing bombs from the clinch. He's charging in, but he's not slow for a big guy. I saw the speed adjusted one,
Yeah, I know. In that fight, sometimes when McVeigh lets both hands go, I mean, it looks quite scary. I would like to be on receiving end of those punches. Powerful hooks, boom, 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 boom. And when he lets his hands go, McVeigh looks terrifying. But Langford fought him. He were bigger. Langford has way better wins against McVeigh than what Wills did. And Langford, could hurt McVeigh quite, well, even though McVeigh was a very durable fighter. Langford could hurt him. Langford could stop him, like he stopped him in 1912 in that fight run they had in 1912 with McIntosh in Australia. So, huge whole fight series they had that year when McIntosh were trying to get Jeanette and trying to get Jack Johnson over to partake in a foursome series of fights. But Johnson and Jeanette didn't go over. But yeah, certainly, I mean, head-to-head resume, I picked Langford's resume over Harry Wills. Head-to-head fights, yeah, Wills won the series. You have to credit him that, but you also have to factor that Langford was past his prime for the large bulk of those fights. So you have to weigh that up. You've also got to weigh the coloured title success, which clearly goes to Langford. The number of top-level wins and contenders has to go to Langford. Aside from the head-to-head, Langford wins in everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of it was like So it just so happens that like Wills debuted in 1911. So by the time Wills debuted, not all of these are heavyweights, of course, but Langford had fought. You know, these aren't the only notable fighters he had fought by that point. Let me take the comment off, but you could see he just and some of these were like multiple fight series. Like Langford had just been going through tons of guys before Wills even debuted. So comparing their careers, you and Langford left the upper ranks before Wills retired, so they don't have a total overlap. And even if you just narrow stuff down to just at heavyweight, there's massive numbers of fights that aren't included in their overlap. But also, you know, like with Johnson, where Johnson fought Langford early in his career, fought Jeanette and McVeigh early in their careers, did extremely well against them, but then he fought them early, whereas late Wills in some of those fights was fighting them late. So I don't count those the same as say like Langford and McVeigh fighting in 1911 and 1912. Like those fights, they were both at their just killers, world class killers. And McVeigh had been, as you know, McVeigh had been out there knocking out some of the guys that extended Langford a little further. Like he was going out the exclamation point. Some of the guys he fought, he would take them out brutally. Langford would beat them maybe brutally, but McVeigh was, I mean, like you said with that footage, it's hard sometimes for people from still photos and from the written word to understand how scary these guys were. People think they were just like arm punching dorks, like who didn't know what they were doing. This was, I mean, they called the sweet science for a reason. Like there's a technique to getting at somebody, breaking down their defense, breaking their body, battering the body to bring the hands down, feinting, to footwork, angles. These guys were experts. They were world class experts, and McVeigh doesn't look the part because he just looks so awesomely scary. He looks like he should be in the A team or something, but he's, you know, he fought on the retreat against Langford. So as vicious as he wasn't about to just go toe to toe with Langford, who he was much larger than, because
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
because Langford was so tough. Like Johnson, the toughest little son of a bitch that ever lived. You don't go toe to toe with Langford, even when Langford was giving up 30 pounds and wasn't in his prime. Johnson had to pull some tricks out to shut Langford down because he wanted to, you know, he couldn't even, when he was a beast, he couldn't even just bash it out with Langford because Langford could take it and he had that willpower to keep fighting. And just to relate that to Joe Calzaghe as a modern era, my favorite, one of the reasons he's my favorite, it's not the level of his competition. It's that when he got hurt, he came back fighting. He came back with a fury, and some of his greatest moments were right after a knockdown where he was, you know,
like like Byron Mitchell, where he suffered first knockdown of his career, and he got up. He looked like, where am I? And then suddenly started swinging punches, and in no time, Byron Mitchell were on floor, and then Calzaghe were throwing like 300 punches non-stop at him to get him out of there. I mean, you know, fantastic comeback from Calzaghe, and like you say, you know, that is a good quality to have. Calzaghe got up and just dismantled him inside of 3 minutes. I mean, it was ridiculous to see, really.
Yeah, and toward the ends of fights that did get later into the fight, Calzaghe would just keep coming forward. He didn't dance away like I got this round. Like with Roy Jones, he's even dropping his hands. He ate and rolled with some shots on practically on purpose. But that kind of daring, to me, that just excites me. But that's separate from a resume. That's not, you know, the ability to win fights and the ability to thrill me personally, totally separate questions. But with Langford, he was a great entertainer, and he would do that. He did that with Atwater, the guy he fought right after Jeanette. Yeah, he let Atwater hit him. I saw in the report he dropped his hands and let Atwater hit him 3 times, then went back to work.
Yeah, it's crazy. Anyway, Random Buddy, I have to jump off in a moment. I have some things to do. I wanted to come on, you know, just give my take on it. I know that if I did a video, if I got a video ready today and uploaded that video, head-to-head matchup, Langford's best heavyweight opponents, Will's best heavyweight opponents, Langford's, people are going to agree with me after looking at that video. They're going to say, yeah, head-to-head, yeah, Will's has more wins, but the heavyweight resume, which is what we were factoring, the greatest heavyweight, that doesn't just mean head-to-head with one fight, it means the whole body of work. Langford wins hands down over Wills, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, and as long as their series was, it was what, like just a few percent of Langford's career. He had 314 fights. So even if you fight 18 times or however many times, that's a tiny percentage of his total body of work. Even just at heavyweight, it's not a big percentage of his just heavyweight career. So yeah, it's what everybody does, and there's definitely a context. But I can't thank you enough for jumping on. That was very cool.
No, it's all good. I'm still at work on my middleweight top 10, just to fill scrapbooking a bit on where I am. I've nailed 8 of them down now. I'm still haggling over 6 fighters for the last 2 places, but I'm getting on with that. So as soon as that's done, I'll let scrapbook know and I'll let you know.
Very cool. Yeah, I threw up a graphic. I got just some of the candidates that I'm juggling in my mind. Not all the candidates, but Robinson, Hagler, Ketchel, Walker, Greb, Hopkins, Fitz, Monzon, Langford. In my mind, they all make arguments, although a bunch of other guys are making arguments in my brain.
Yeah, because you've got Emil Griffith, you've got Jeff Smith, you've got, even fighters like Teddy Uroz. I mean, there's so many fighters you can consider at middleweight. It's going to be interesting to see, what we come up with. But, like Scrapbook alluded to earlier, it's not a debate. It's more about education and information. And, whatever our criteria is, whatever we want to use, ultimately, hopefully people learn a thing or two here or there. And that's really the main thing. That's the only important thing. What I've come to realize on YouTube with Idiocy last year is that, I no longer care really what people think. I care about what I think. The main thing when these people come to me saying, well, you're wrong, you should do this. Well, you're wrong, you should rate this way. Well, you should consider this. I'm like, well, no, I should. I'll consider what I like, how I like, thank you. And if you don't agree, that's cool. But ultimately, you're not going to change my mind. I'm going to rate how I rate. And it's going to be a great discussion. There's going to be a lot of good information in there. And hopefully some food for thought for people. Hopefully what people come away with, like the Langford years, the Greb years, the best heavyweight 1900, 1925, these live streams that me, you and Scrapbook do, the one hope I have, and I'm sure Scrapbook and I'm sure yourself will agree with me, is that some people come away learning a thing or two, or maybe someone comes away wanting to research one of these fighters based on what we say and expand their own, know-how on who some of these fighters were. I think that's a really important thing. About historical boxing talk is that we do our bit to help pass knowledge of these great fighters down, and then people do with that information what they will. But, like you were influenced by a video of mine on Sam Langford. Someone could listen to our upcoming live stream with me, you and Scrapbook. They could get influenced to become a super Jeff Smith fan or a super Mickey Walker fan. This kind of thing is what is the benefit to me. And that is the important thing.
Yeah, and it's I learned so much from you, and I went and searched, and I was like, and I won't mention the channel, but I saw a debate you did. It was just between Sam Langford and Jack Johnson. And I thought you represented yourself well, but you also gave Johnson credit. And I saw in the comments people were saying, "Oh, you gave too much credit." And I'm like, dude, he's talking about Jack Johnson, talking about another all-time great. You have to give him his credit.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
and that's the difference between a debate and a discussion. You were having a discussion as much as a debate, and the other person was making their best effort to debate. And I think maybe
I'll tell you something random. I'll fill you in. On my old channel, it doesn't exist anymore, but I did a live stream. It was nearly 3 hours long because someone had come to me and said, "Oh, right, Sugar Ray Leonard is obviously way greater than Langford because he won titles in 5 weights." So again, one of those narrow band kind of critiques of my view. So what I did is I went on a live stream and I went year by year on live stream. I started combined year 1, Langford's first year 1902, Leonard's first year, then to year 2, and I broke down every year who they fought, the fights they had, the results, the quality wins they had in those years. And by the end of it, it was a destruction. Some years Leonard were fighting once or twice. Some years not even fighting. And in those years, Langford were having piles of fights against elite opposition. And it was so one-sided when I put it in that way. And I could do that, but I don't like to do that because I don't like to downplay Sugar Ray Leonard as a fighter. He was an outstanding fighter, but I am prepared also to defend the great fighters if they come under like ad hominem attack. Then I will put the information out there. Ultimately, people will make up their own minds what to do with it. But, when you go year on year, Langford and Sugar Ray Leonard, I'm sorry, the careers are not even close.
Yeah, I remember
Not
you did it
close at all.
I remember you did, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you did a year by year, you changed your format for one, and you said, well, I'm not going to talk about it after this, but you did Mayweather, and I think it was Sugar Ray Robinson. You did the year-to-year records through their careers.
Oh, yes, I did. Yes, I did, yeah.
I really enjoyed that. That was a
I did a number of videos like that, yeah.
Yeah, that was a destruction because, and that's how I tend to start thinking of these fighters, because I'm like, yeah, you might fight at a high level, but if you fight and take 4 months off, and this other guy fights, and then he's fighting a week later, and then he fights 4 days after that, and then he fights 2 weeks after that, and then he fights 3 weeks after that, and then the next week, and then twice in the week, and then the other guy has a fight. Those aren't the same kinds of years. And Langford had a bunch of years, as you know, that he did. But can I make a quick shout out? So Scrap put up a great video about the color line. He mentioned
yes, I've seen part one. I know he's got some other parts up. I have to catch up to them as well. I'm going to try and find time today. But Scrapbook part, those are seeming to be great videos, buddy, and I can't wait to see the other parts. Fantastic information in those videos.
Yeah, and he says here in the comment, exactly, Bill, I want others to learn and think. Well, thank you once again, Scrapbook, because I learned something. So right here on the left there, that's Sam Mcveigh with his trainer, Peter Felix. Scrap was mentioning in his video that Peter Felix was the cousin of Peter Jackson, the Australian great.
Yeah, Peter Felix was a fighter as well.
Right. So I didn't realize that he was related to Peter Jackson. So I learned something important about the lineage of this rich era. I'm one of the guys I'm most interested in just yesterday, thanks to Scrapbook. And so, that sparks my curiosity because now I have another piece of the puzzle, because there are a lot of these guys were related or trained with each other. And I'm still piecing all that together, even though I've spent more time looking at it than most ever would bother, separate from actual, dedicated historical enthusiasts like yourselves. Most people don't know anything about this era, but I'm learning things every single day, and sometimes it's just being exposed to it. So the work you and Scrap are doing.
To give you an idea about what kind of thing, I once got a comment laid to me, and he did this video responding to one of my videos and rating Harry Greb above Gene Tunney. This was back in 2015. I'd only been on YouTube about 6 months. It was about May, June 2015. And this guy did a response video to me, basically laughing at me, saying, well, how can you rate Greb over Tunney? Because in the fight they had, Tunney was completely dominant and could have probably finished Greb at any time. And I left a comment to him saying, and this kind of goes back to why people should learn. And I went back to him, no, I think the fight you're on about is the 5th fight. They had 5. And then he responded to me in comments saying, no, they didn't have 5. And I put a comment saying, no, they did have 5 fights. Go away to Google. I actually said this to him in comments. I was a bit snotty. I probably shouldn't have been, but I was a bit snotty. And I said, well, you go away to Google. I'll hang around on your comment section and wait for you to reply to me for 5 minutes. And you go away and see how many fights they had. So he left a comment saying, okay, I'll check now. And it was all quiet for about 5 minutes. So I left a comment saying, have you been to Google yet? Have you searched Gene Tunney Harry Greb fight series? And then comment came through, oh, yeah, you're right. They did fight 5 times. But Tunney won last one clearly. Still trying to defend his point of view. So then I said to him, well, Greb won the first one clearly. And one of the others was a draw. And one of the others that Tunney won was judged to be a complete robbery. So was Tunney really dominant over Greb? And he said, yeah, he won 3 out of 5. I'm like, well, there you go. You're totally ignoring me.
Yeah, it's like a lot of the
things to their own way.
Yes, sir. It's like a lot of the talking points, they're easily disprovable, but it's almost like people don't get attention with measured, reasonable comments enough, so they take extreme positions on purpose, which I don't agree with, but I just try to understand it. But things are easily disprovable with a little bit of searching. It doesn't take a lot of searching. A lot of it's just free out there on the internet. It used to be people would struggle to get information. They'd have to get periodicals. They'd have to really try or go to place on location. Now you can just jump online and find stuff. Even newspaper clippings, even if you can't download them without the highlighted part from the search function, you can still find tons of newspaper clippings even without paying money like I do. But it's just like the talking point with big heavyweights. We know there are tons of big guys. Even though there were less big people in the world, we know that is also true. But boxing was more like nowadays, like heavyweight boxers, that isn't the sum of it, because you got heavyweight kickboxers and heavyweight MMA. There are a lot of guys who are big, tough fighter type guys who go into mixed rules because it gets attention as well. Even though the money's shit, a lot of people are dreaming of doing that, or their skill set is more appropriate for that kind of fighting. That's often the case. They have more of a wrestling base or grappling acumen. They don't mind checking kicks, blocking shin kicks with your own shin, which hurts to on both ends. Just hurts the kicking guy more. So
I mean,
it's shared. That's okay.
If I can throw, and this again kind of highlights my point. I had, it was the same guy actually, but it was about 2 years later. He did a video saying that, when Floyd Mayweather had a break after he beat Atom when he defended the WBC welter title after he beat De La Hoya at light middleweight, he then defended his title against Atom, didn't he? And then he went into this retirement. And then, as we know, Floyd Mayweather came back, fought Juan Manuel Marquez, and from the Marquez fight, into the Shane Mosley fights, into the Ortiz fights, the Guerrero fights, etc. Leading up to the Pacquiao fight in 2015, I think it were 9 fights he had to Pacquiao. I think Berto would have been 10, or were it 9? But 9 or 10 fights. And basically, this guy, and this is why I always say to people, I don't really comment on things if I don't know something. I think it's really ridiculous when people leave crazy comments like Floyd Mayweather's fight run from 2009 until 2015. The quality of fights and the wins he had in that period, like 6 years, cannot be matched by any fighter in boxing history. And I was thinking, well, 2 wins over Maidana, win over Victor Ortiz, win over Robert Guerrero, win over a Shane Mosley, who even before the fight, people had been saying that Margarito fight, he were past his prime. So when he fought Mayweather, he suddenly wasn't past his prime. But ignoring that, so I did this thing, and this guy had said on video, not even Sugar Ray Robinson has a fight run in 6 years that can match what Mayweather did. And he also said on that video, Mayweather fought way more experienced fighters. So me, what I did is I went away and I created a graph, okay? And down middle at slide, it had 10 fights, no fights, 10 fights, 20 fights, 30 fights, all the way down to 100 plus. So that were down middle. And then on left and right side, I put Sugar Ray Robinson's name at top on one and Floyd Mayweather at top on other. And I listed how many opponents they had fought. I used to do really crazy videos. I don't do them that crazy anymore, but I listed how many fighters they fought who had 0 fights, 10 fights, or 40 fights, or 80 fights, or 90 fights between Ray Robinson and Floyd Mayweather. And then I worked it out into percentages of the career. And this guy who said, oh, well, Mayweather fought way more experienced fighters. I think Robinson fought piles of fighters who had over 100 career fights. Mayweather never fought anybody, I think, who had more than 70 at that time. So Robinson had people who fought over 80. He had a number of people who fought over 90. He had piles of people who fought over 100 fights. He had way more fighters he fought who had 40 fights, 50 fights, 60 fights. He just crushed him, absolutely crushed him. And then I went into fight run, the 6 years, 91 fights unbeaten. The opponents he beat in those 6 years. And then at the end of it, I thought, oh, I'll throw a counterpoint. And I put Harry Greb in there, a 6-year period from 1917 to 1922. And I listed his fight record, all the top level fighters he'd fought, his record against them, the Hall of Fame record, and everything. And people came to me and said, oh, that video's unmatchable. You have just crushed Floyd Mayweather. And at the time I thought, well, yeah, I don't like doing it, but at the end of the day, if someone's going to reference me directly and challenge me and come out with something so ludicrous as that, then I have to respond to that. But, I've kind of tempered off of it. I used to respond a lot more like that than what I do now. Now I just do my thing and I don't really care what, these people out there say based on their criteria as such. When they're criticizing, it don't really matter to me. But
well, you got it out of your system. I remember that video. I'm pretty sure I remember that video. It was about, what, 2.5 years ago?
No, I re-uploaded it 2.5 years ago, but the original, I think, was from 2016
Oh, that was
But
some
then,
classic Boxic Librarian. Yeah, see, I came
yeah,
in,
when I
you were on
closed
your
my
new
channel
channel.
down, that were one of video. I had hundreds of videos stored on a hard drive, so that were one of videos. So it then got re-uploaded to Hardline Boxing Talk, but it was off my original Boxing Librarian channel.
Oh, I see. Was that long 2-part talk on Greb? Was that also a pre-existing one?
Yes, and the 3-part Langford and 3-part Legend series I did, Harry Greb and Langford, they were from originals. There's still a lot of original content, especially on my career breakdown playlist and on my historical information playlist. There's still quite a lot of videos from the original channel on there that I uploaded afterwards. The fights of Harry Wills, more on an orangey, sandy coloured background. That's another of the original videos from the original Hardline Boxing Talk channel. Boxing
It's
Librarian
fascinating.
channel.
Well, I'm grateful that
So,
you uploaded some of that prior content, and that you have so many great videos I'd encourage people to check out, especially certain fighters where it I was totally shocked as you go through significant fights. Like what was one of the ones that shook me? The Battling Levinsky video was just astounding. I couldn't believe it. When you put into context who people were, Battling Levinsky, the Maxie Rosenblum, obviously, that was a monster. But the Battling Levinsky, because I didn't know anything about him, I saw this and I was like, oh my good God, the level of competition. And then relating that to today, where guys, they're fighting at a high level, they're having good fights, and people are familiar with all the fighters. So it takes on more importance than it would in the history books. Because, I don't know if people know, but if you go to just BoxRec, they don't have complete records, but they have good records for a lot of decades. They're fairly complete. And you look at the win-loss record of opponents, there are guys that just never come up in any discussion everywhere who had great win-loss records when someone beat them. They just didn't necessarily have a packed one, especially in the 20s and 30s. Some of these records are great. This guy's like 53-3, but no one's ever heard of him. Well, that's because of the level of fighter he was beating, and maybe if there are plenty of people who win lots of fights and then lose at the highest level, or mostly lose at the highest level, and they're forgotten. And there are guys today who do that who aren't forgotten yet. That's all.
I always shout there's a whole bunch of names, but 3 names that spring to mind. Because people may see on fighters' records names like Leo Lomsky, Del Flanagan, and another one called Lou Scosa. When you actually go to, because people will scroll down, these all-time greats resumes and see these names, like Lomsky and Scosa. But when you actually, and Del Flanagan, but when you actually go down their resumes, Lou Scosa and Leo Lomsky, they have stupid resumes. I mean, stupid resumes. And the number of top-level fighters, top-rated fighters they beat is insane, considering that there were just contenders who get no credit from anyone. And, this is another reason why, after this current spate of videos, by end of June, I'm going to be starting more blue screens. There's more fighters' careers being covered. Way more fighters being added in to my blue screen playlists, as well as other videos. But that's why I'm going back and doing more of those for, because we're adding people like Joao Henrique, we're adding people like Gonsalves, all these other fighters, Tommy Paul. Okay, some people may see on Holman Williams' record, he beat a fighter called Tommy Paul, okay, down at featherweight. And some people may think, oh, well, Tommy Paul, yeah, never heard of him. But have they seen Tommy Paul's resume? It is staggering. So that's what I always say. I always err on side of caution and tell people that research is the best tool you can have. Okay, if you go away and research, it gives you a much stronger basis on which to deliberate on these subjects, rather than not knowing very little about an era and then just coming out with carte blanche statements. I always think that is ludicrous in a way. I'm not referencing the general left the comment there, but I am really going to have to get off though, buddy, now I think. I've really got a few stuff to do. So, but I would like to say thank you for inviting me on. Thank you for allowing me on. And big shout out to guys in chat like Antonio Mosley. Always love having him around my channel and live chats, and of course, Scrapbook Boxing. And yourself, I'm going to get this list of 10 finished. I'm going to get them final places nailed down. I might change my mind on the day. You never know, because the last 2 or 3 are a real headache. There's more than 6 fighters. There's probably 15 fighters who I can consider.
Yeah, I'm going to have
a real headache.
I'm gonna have a backup list. So I've decided I'm gonna have like just handwritten notes. I'm gonna make note of my list, but I'm gonna have alternates for each slot that I'm pretty, because I know that like I'm gonna end up probably with a pool of 15, and then 10. I'll have 10 I intend to use. But last time when we did the heavyweights countdown, as we were doing it, I was like, oh, I should have thought of that guy. It was tough, some guys like Fulton. I was tempted to put him in my list, and I went with like Jeffries for different reasons, But then while we were doing, I was like, you know what? And Gunboat, I can't remember if I had Gunboat in my list. See, I changed my mind during the thing, even at the top.
Yeah, because if I remember, Gunboat were on my list. I put Gunboat on my list. Gunboat, Jeff Clark, as well as bigger names, Wills Langford, Jeanette McVeigh, Johnson. I had Gunboat on there. I had Jeff Clark on there. So yeah, it's
yeah. It was tough. I did have Clark on my list, but then there were other guys I felt like I was leaving out. Fulton was a guy I thought about, and I think Gunboat I didn't end up picking. But then I was like, I knew he had a giant resume. I knew he'd gotten the best of Langford back when Langford was still Langford with a capital Langford. He was when he was still the boss. But yeah, it was. But all in all, I just learned a lot, and I'm grateful for that. Like whenever we do these, I'm the biggest beneficiary in my mind, is I'm learning from you two guys, and then I'm also just helping celebrate these fighters so other people may potentially learn about them at the same time. Being a part of that and also directly learning stuff is just wonderful. I appreciate your comments on the trickiness of just going on head-to-head contests, because sometimes the head-to-head contest does indicate the overall resume comparison, but it's not because of it. Like Langford beating up Jack O'Brien. Well, Jack O'Brien was a shell of himself a couple years before they even fought. As I've seen in the papers, this is not me saying it looking on paper. This is the people at the time, what they were saying about Jack O'Brien. So even though he put in a long camp, he'd already been through so much. They'd been talking for years about eventually he'll run out of steam because he fought so often, but it took a long time for it. So, but even though Langford has a better resume than Jack O'Brien, who was a great fighter himself, and he did beat him, that's not beating him directly wasn't why Langford goes above Jack O'Brien. As you look at their whole careers, O'Brien could have scored an upset, and he still wouldn't have the resume Langford had.
So really, throwing a quick last counterpoint in there before I get off, take again what I mentioned earlier, the Tony Greb series. So, if I wanted, I could say, yeah, Tony's greater than Greb because he beat him 3 out of 5. But then you could also say, well, last 3 fights they had, Greb were blind in one eye. He was past his prime. Greb were past his prime by 1923. He were already past his prime when he fought Johnny Wilson and got middleweight title. He were already past his prime. So can we then, could I then discount Tony's wins against Greb? That makes it an even fight series. Then you see, it's basically all on how people rate. But I've always had a mantra, and I've always said it right back from when I came on YouTube and before I went on YouTube. I look at the whole career. If I'm looking at, like, take greatest middleweights, okay, I could come into that looking at, right, fixed criteria of what they did at middleweight, or looking at criteria of what titles they won at middleweight, or I could come in and say, you know what, I'm being loose, saying who was the best fighter at light middleweight, not even factoring titles. You can rate on many different things, but I just try and give an informed view on basically all the things considered. When I'm not doing automated ratings, which are more about creating a system where I can rate every fighter in history I want to, without my opinion coming into it. When I'm actually using my opinion, I will look at resume. I will look at accomplishments. I will look at if fighters are past the prime or not. I will look at, the skill set at that division and how effective a fighter I believe they were at that decision. I don't think I could focus on, well, I think this guy's more skilled. I'll ignore the resume. I'll ignore the title accomplishments. Or I wouldn't say, well, this guy would have had a better title record, so therefore I'll ignore resume. I'll ignore other fighters' skill. I think that's a very dangerous way and a crazy way of rating fighters.
Yeah, it's complicated, but part of it is also to make definitive statements, and it takes a lot of surrounding information to make a nuanced opinion about something as deep and textured as boxing history. I mean, we're talking about all of boxing history. Even like if we were doing the top 10 middleweights of the last 10 years, that would be a lot easier, because it's a
simple. Golovkin, Canelo, Martinez. You'd have all these guys in there, wouldn't you? Sturm maybe, but Yeah, well, Stone would be in if it were top 10 at last 10 years, no doubt. And being
right?
thick as sponge.
Or even if you took a newer division and just did all time, like say all time top super middleweights, that would still be a good discussion, but you could probably get the pool of 10 fairly comfortably. But if you're talking about middleweight that goes all the way back, I mean, if you're talking about early greats like O'Brien and nonpareil Jack Dempsey and Tommy Ryan, before you even get, it's like, and then Langford and Ketchel, like, and Papke and
even
all
at
these
middleweight
different
and
guys.
light heavyweight, you look at not the most accomplished fighter, but what an outstanding fighter he was. Charles Kid McCoy at middle and light heavy. He would have been he won a few fighters in over 100 fights to beat Tommy Ryan. He was an outstanding fighter, a real handful to beat. So you could consider him. Well, he beat Tommy Ryan. He won only two men to beat Tommy Ryan.
Right.
He had a big career himself.
Tommy West was one of those top. He was a middleweight, correct?
He was a very tough middleweight contender, Tommy West. Very good contender.
And I saw an article where Jack Johnson and another fighter, I can't remember, were helping Tommy West prepare for a battle he had coming up on the West Coast. Like, these great fighters were training with and training each other. And color lines be damned, that didn't count with training. You know what I mean? Like Big Bill Tate and Bob Armstrong and Langford, these guys could help white fighters get ready for title shots. They just couldn't necessarily get the opportunity themselves, but they were in there. These guys were all intermingling. It would be much more rare for someone to be like, I just don't even want to be around a colored fighter. No, oftentimes that was part of the hypocrisy of it, is these guys could help people. Jack Johnson could help Tommy West go out, and I think he might have been for a title fight, go fight on the West Coast, even while he was being denied.
I think the middleweights is another great example, because take like you have fighters like I mentioned earlier, Teddy Ross. You've also got poor man's Harry Greb, Ken Overlin, a very hard fighter to be at his best. Ezard Charles struggled to beat Ken Overlin, at middleweight. You look at Ken Overlin, he held one at NSAC NBA titles. He wasn't the undisputed champion, but another super tough middleweight. You look at Teddy Ross, you look at the middleweight runs, you look at many fighters around those weights going down a weight, Joey Giambra, you look at his resume is outstanding. So you've got to factor the whole thing. You've got, and at middleweight, I'm factoring, the whole thing. I'm not gonna downplay any fighter by ignoring criteria that could be important for that fighter. I'm gonna look at all of it. I'm not just gonna say, well, in a head-to-head, this guy won, so he'll go in my top 10, and this guy won't. I'm gonna look at everything about that fighter. Like I said, I've got 7 or 8 nailed down. The last two or three spots are going to be hard work. Is it 7 or 8? I've got 5, 6. Oh, it's last 3 spots I'm nailing down now.
You're a machine. Hey, another point I would make is, if you were rating, okay, so Sam Langford in 1903, I have 1905 pulled up for a different reason, but in 03, Langford beat Joe Gans, the great Joe Gans, head to head, and that was the only long fight loss in a huge span of fights for Gans. I think it was 17 fights unbeaten before he lost newspaper decision after the loss to Langford. And he was on a huge streak until the Jack Blackburn, the short fight loss, a short while before the Langford fight. But you can't even, if you look at their 1903s, you can't even necessarily rate Langford over Gans that year, the year that he went 1-0 against him.
That's right. Yeah.
Because Gans overall had better work.
But he doesn't. Yeah, he wasn't. Gans were a lightweight champion that year,
Right, and he got McFadden in 04. So but in 03, he got Patsy Sweeney, got
what's his name?
Patrick Cote.
Yeah.
He was supposed to fight McFadden in 03, and I can't remember who stepped in. It was like a guy who's not any kind of name stepped in and got knocked out. I'm pretty sure. I'm not sure if he got knocked out, but he stepped in and lost against Langford. I don't know if I have that year. Do I have that year? Oh, that's 04. Yeah, he ended up fighting McFadden, but he was supposed to fight him, and he pulled out. I can't remember who stepped in. It might have been Belf. No, maybe not. I don't want to say anything. But what I was saying is, like, that year, Gans fought a tremendous record. He had 9 wins that year. So even though Langford beat him head to head and had 27 fights with only 1 loss, that doesn't mean even that in that single year he did more work than Joe Gans, even though he beat Joe Gans himself. That's what the records of those years, that's what, Jack Blackburn got the best of Langford in a pre-range draw, and doesn't necessarily rank over Langford that year. even in
I
spirit,
mean,
because of the
and
overall
also,
work each of them did.
also another really key thing that people have to remember as well is take Terence Crawford, for example. We know he's titled lightweight, light welter, being undisputed titled at welter, still unbeaten in his career. Okay, so we don't doubt Terence Crawford's skill set. We don't doubt that he's been one of the more dominant champions of recent years. He's an unbeaten 3-weight champion. He's been undisputed. We don't doubt any of that. But if I were to say, okay, so we give Terence Crawford credit for his skills, his great title success, the resume he has built, but does his resume rate above an Isaac Logart or a Eddie Shear or a Henry Hank, or even say a fighter, another lightweight champion, okay, called Jimmy Goodrich? Okay, now people will be saying, BL, who is that? Who is Jimmy Goodrich? Well, to people who don't know, you will find out when I do his video, and you will think, oh, right, yeah, he's got a lot of defeats, but oh my God, that opposition is insane. So Crawford is more accomplished and Crawford is more skilled, but then how does the overall resume factor into it? And this is what I was saying earlier. We have to factor everything. I'm not saying Jimmy Goodrich is a greater fighter or a better fighter or a worse fighter than Terence Crawford, but it's just the example of you have to factor all these things in. You know, if I go to a Lou Feldman and say, well, Lou Feldman, you know, clearly Crawford is a more superior fighter. Clearly in a fantasy fight, I will pick Crawford to beat Lou Feldman up. But when you add in their overall opposition and you look at Lou Feldman's opposition or Aldo Spaldi's opposition, or terrifyingly, a fighter who's got a video ready in my new blue screen, Saverio Turriello. When you look at the fighters and their opposition they fought, you know, yes, you could say Crawford's better skilled. I think Crawford would win the head-to-head that was discussed in Wills and Langford. But as he fought better opposition than Lou Feldman, Jimmy Goodrich, Aldo Spaldi, Turriello, not a chance. Heaven forbid Henry Hank and Isaac Logart, not a chance, as he even fought opposition on their level. So
Yeah,
it
I think
all has to be factored.
that's an excellent point, because how someone looks is all relative to who they're fighting. Like Barbados Walcott, right? He has more losses than a lot of these welterweights that people think of as great, but he was fighting far. He could make 142 with ease. At times he was walking around below that, and he was fighting heavyweights in his resume. So you can't take Terence Crawford and be like, all right, we'll go fight a top 20 heavyweight and let's just see how it goes. Fight, it doesn't even have to be a top 3, top 5, top 10. Just fight a top 20, 25, top 30 heavyweight. Go fight a big guy who's skilled, skilled enough to be ranked, and let's see how that goes. Will you get knocked out? Are you going to look foolish?
Give Terence Crawford 2 weeks' notice, and then he's fighting Alexander Usyk. See how he gets on. 2 weeks' notice or a week's notice, or 3 days' notice. You know?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, sorry, go ahead.
If I may add one other thing as well, that is something else you see. Like I've said, you've got to factor everything. Also, who's the greatest heavyweight in that period? One of the prime dominant thing that I've always mentioned, and I've always tried to impress on people, you have to factor this. You know, take Iron Mike Tyson in 80s, you know, he were beating Burbick, Smith, Tubbs, Tucker, you know, Terrell Biggs, Bruno, Carl Williams, Michael Spinks, Larry Holmes. Impressive run for Tyson. Could I ask someone out there, how impressive would those same wins be if it were Roberto Duran who jumped up to heavyweight and bet all those guys? Would that be more impressive than Mike Tyson doing it as a heavyweight? The answer is obviously yes. People would say, well, Duran, oh my, yeah, Tyson beat those heavyweights in dominating fashion for the most part, but Duran came from lightweight and he did the same.
Yeah, that's where I
exactly. There you go, Langford.
Excellent point. I struggle with that with Langford, Ali, and Joe Louis, because these are, to me, these are the 3 greatest heavyweights, but they're for dramatically different reasons. You know,
if I may add something, that's what I'm doing with the Langford Joe Louis thing, and Ali may also be subjected to it, because I have a huge headache in my head because I'm aware of all 3 of their resumes. I'm aware that for the established titles, Ali and Joe Louis have that like glittering, shining beacons. You know, Louis with the title record reign, most heavyweight title fight knockouts, most defenses, most title fight wins, longest lineal reign. You know, with Ali, the first 3-time heavyweight champion, first 3-time undisputed heavyweight champion. You know, etc., etc. Fighting every top contender of his era, pretty much, except for people like Dwayne Bobbick. Yeah, but he pretty much fought every major contender of his era. So those have those glittering things. But I have always argued that I think Langford's resume is more than a match for theirs, and may actually in some ways better theirs. Now, in saying that, I'm not saying that a McVeigh or a Jeanette definitely beat a Foreman, or a Ken Norton, etc., or a Frazier. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying for the level of opposition they fought in their time, I think that Langford could potentially destroy Joe Louis's resume. And that will be a feature of a video to come. And it's not me trying to put Joe Louis down. It's me in my head thinking out on video, because I have the argument of those three there, those three are my 3 greatest heavyweights of all time. And I have long argued about who goes 1, who goes 2, who goes 3. I once put Langford number 1. Prior to that, I'd had Ali number 1. Prior to Langford going number 1, I had Joe Louis number 1 for a time, and I shimmied Ali down to 2, thinking, you know, those accomplishments have stood for like 90 years nearly. Well, it was 80 years at the time. They've stood for like 80 years. He's set unprecedented records that no fighter in history, all these great heavyweight champions have not come close to breaking. You know, those accolades are very powerful with his, you know, dominance over division and fighting all top contenders pretty much. But I've always had that debate between the three, and the Louis and Langford video, when it comes, it's going to be a few months off because I've got plans. Everything's on schedule now. But when it does come, it's not so much about me putting Langford or Louis down. It's more about me examining who has the better heavyweight resume. Because at the end of that video, if people disagree with me, then the debate point's mute. If people agree with me that Langford's heavyweight resume made far better Joe Louis, then the question becomes, well, how much does Louis's title reign beat Langford's resume? Which is better? There, you know, having the accomplishments puts you in the record books, but Langford has his own set of accomplishments.
Absolutely.
Heavyweight title. So then it becomes a debate of, well, what's better? This guy has a better resume at heavyweight, but this guy has the better established title credentials. So which one weighs better against each other? And it's part of me trying to work out and solidify my top 3 for all time.
100%. Boom, boom, boom. And it's also like, you know, between these 3 gentlemen, you know, they all had title accomplishments, just that history doesn't remember the colored heavyweight title the same way. But did Joe Louis have an easier run defending his title against these guys in all these different cities than Langford had, fighting Jeanette and McVeigh and Wills and, you know, some of the competition he had? Plus Langford was fighting white fighters, not for that title, but he was fighting other top guys. You know, does one outweigh the other? Because did Joe Louis fight that many fights against guys who are on McVeigh, Jeanette, or Wills level? I don't know. I don't know if he had that many fights. He certainly didn't have dozens of them. Neither of the other 2 guys have dozens and dozens and dozens of Hall of Fame fights at heavyweight the way that Langford does.
One thing, if I may, about that is, and it's a debate I had a number of years ago. This was long before I came on YouTube. This was way back in like 2010, 2011. And I was talking to a guy on the old kind of internet, AOL, on this like message board thing, you know. And I was talking, and this guy basically said that Jack Johnson eclipses Langford because he held the world heavyweight title and Langford didn't. So I countered him and said, well, Langford's a 5-time colored heavyweight champion to Jack Johnson's 1. And he replied something along the lines of, yeah, but that doesn't matter because Johnson won the lineal heavyweight title. And then I remember going back at him saying, well, okay, I'll give you that. So in established heavyweight title, Johnson does better. Colored heavyweight title, Langford does better. So who has the better resume across both? It is clearly, to me, Langford. Well, not totally clearly, but Langford beats Johnson in my mind on the overall resume. You know, nearly 50 fights with Jeanette, Wilson, McVeigh. I'm sorry, Johnson can't match that. You know, yeah, he fought Jeanette 7 times. Yeah, he beat McVeigh 3 times in his first 12 pro fights. He never fought Eddie Wills, you know, etc., etc. So, but, you know, I've been having this debate a long time. How much are these titles worth?
Right, and I try to narrow down and say, well, how hotly contested is something? So obviously Ali was fighting for very hotly contested title status, and so was Joe Louis in a way that's underrated today. Your excellent video on his thing. He fought a ridiculous.
Oh,
He kept a ridiculous win-loss record against top 10 and top 3 level fighters, like people who
yes,
were
he did. Yeah, yeah.
who got to the near the top of the division in their careers, and he had an incredible record against them. Langford had a lot more losses, but he also has a lot more wins in that realm than Ali and Lewis. And Ali might have fought in the richest era, but or possibly as far as diverse talent, but Langford had far more fights against the best of the era, of an also rich era.
If I could point out one thing to people, it's this, and this will be all demonstrated, okay, on my video, Joe Louis and Sam Langford heavyweight matchup, is people have to remember Joe Louis had 69 pro fights. Langford has nearly that number of coloured heavyweight title fights alone. That is not even counting all the other heavyweight fighters he fought. So that Langford has had nearly as many coloured heavyweight title fights as Joe Louis had career fights, full career fights. And that is missing off loads of the heavyweight fighters like Jim Flynn, Fultons, Meehan's, all these other heavyweights Langford fought are not even added to that number. So this is going to give people an idea of what that video is going to be like, and I'm doing it loosely. I'm not going to make sure I nail every. I've already got most of heavyweight fights he's had down. There's a few more I'm ambiguous on. If they don't get, I won't add them. But pretty much it's going to be an eye opener for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's definitely stunning. And Langford, I mean, part of the reason and it could have been any number of videos, but Langford, for several reasons I outlined before in previous chats, resonated with me on multiple levels. But when you said, and his career goes on forever, but by the end of the video, even though I was braced for it, it was so much, and I was like, how could one man possibly do all of this? And this was an era, it turns out, after some study, that lots of people did lots of things, but Langford even stands head and shoulders above them. And that's why when you're talking about fights at the highest level, most could never even approach his level of competition over a length of a career, and all the other factors like losing sight in one eye and then losing sight in both eyes, and how good he was when he was a shell of himself. Like I know we're going to get off soon, but if I can pull up a year you highlighted in, I think as his number 5 toughest year.
1920.
1920. I mean, yes, okay, he did lose to Wills that year, and he lost to Pinky Lewis. I think there's at least one other, in Big Bill Tate and Lee Anderson. But then he had just a shit ton of wins that same year. This is 3 years after or 2.5 years after he's lost sight in one eye, and he's keeping that win-loss record. It's like other guys aren't facing that kind of adversity. So of course, yeah, he picked up 4 losses that year at least. Yeah, he kept a win-loss record that looks like a modern career. I mean, just in 1 year, and it's like, and not all those fights are low-level fights. It's not like because lots of boxers churn through a year and they basically, their biggest danger is beating up their hands too much. But that wasn't the case with Langford. So I give great credit to Wills for wins even as late as 1920, because Langford was still beating the crap out of a bunch of guys. He beat Jeff Clark that year. He had some good wins that year. It's just that Wills was better. So even though I'm spend a lot of effort this morning explaining why I thought earlier, especially before you jumped on, why I thought Langford justly goes over Wills, but I give huge credit to Wills for those wins because he's still beating a world-class guy. It's just that,
yeah, Wills is a legitimate great heavyweight to me, without a shadow of a doubt.
I have him inside 10. I have him inside 10 across all of history.
I have him inside top 5, to be honest, and he deserves to be there. And yeah, I think he is an outstanding heavyweight fighter without a doubt. But I am going to have to get off, buddy. I've had a missed call off my wife on this phone, and she's now calling my daughter's phone. So just in case there's no emergency that I have to deal with, I will need to get off now.
I understand. Family first. Thank you for coming on. It's a pleasure. Scrapbook, it's wonderful to have you in the chat. I just appreciate you guys. I'm gonna do more of these talks when I get off work, because it's actually, the house is nice and quiet. Thank you for coming
Yeah,
on.
and watch out for my video to come. Langford, Joe Louis, the heavyweight matchup, heavyweight fights only. That hopefully will be an eye-opener, and hopefully will help my mind finally work out my top 3.
Yeah, and after we do this top 10 middleweights of all time, last thing I'll say, we're gonna have to do a top 10 heavyweights of all time, or 15. We got
Do you know
to.
a really tough one?
What's that?
2 really tough ones are top 10 lightweights and top 10 bantamweights.
I'm not qualified to do bantamweight, even as a casual, but lightweights, I've already started working on a list. We could do it.
Yeah. Welterweight's another tough one, although I've got 7 or 8 in my welterweights nailed down.
Welters would be tough for me, because there's some guys that are still outside my. But I'm down for anything, man. I'm down to do as many of these as you guys want, or even if Scrap's more limited in its availability, me and you, we can do them as much as you want. These are a pleasure.
Well, I felt enriched having Scrapbook's involvement, and long may it continue. I know there may be times when you and Scrap may go live and I may be unavailable for some reason, or vice versa. But I think the chats we've been having are really, really excellent chats, and they're providing a good level of information for boxing fans out there. So long may it continue, and I am down for any of them. And like I said before I get off, if Scrapbook knew anyone who could come on who'd be a good contributor, or you did, I'm all good with that as well. Or we can keep it to us 3, or every now and then we may get a 4th person on, like an Antonio Mosley, or a Trey X, or someone else. But we'll see how you go. It's your channel at the end of the day, and you'll decide.
I'm cool with the regulars. The regulars. I'm a very cautious person, because basically, if someone comes on the stream talking, right, and if someone comes on one of my streams and talks some crazy mess, I got to take the stream down. I'm going to consider that a big loss that I took for not screening properly, and that's the thing. My last chat, someone said, "Hey, drop the link," but I don't know who they are, and I'm not. I went to channel some sort of thing, and I'm like, I'll take my
off to you. Do not drop that link to anybody you don't know. I've been through a quagmire on YouTube of making friends, falling out with people lying on me about reasons why I fall out with people trying to stir, people trying to do this, people trying to hate on me, all this nonsense. And the thing I realized last year, when people started saying I'd done something because of something that's a total lie, the thing I realized is that if I don't know who you are, if I have not interacted with you an amount in my comment section, there's no chance you're coming on a live. There's no chance you're getting a link. There's no chance I want to interact with you other than the comment section. Unless I know who you are, I don't care. And that's the decision I made last year, and that is what I'm sticking to.
Yeah, because it's like, for me, it's like, the comment section is cool. That's like emailing somebody, but having a discussion and getting on my channel is more like, that's more like come visit in my house. It's not open to everybody, and you guys are grown adults. I'm a grown man. I don't have time for that kid stuff. Other people do, but it's not for me.
To me, people like Trey X, to me, 86 Boxing, to me, there's certain people out there who'd be great additions, who would be trouble-free. But there's also a lot of people out there. When I first started doing not these lives, but the old Google on Air Hangouts, the original live stream, what Google ran, what everybody used on YouTube pretty much from 14 to 17, 18, before Google on Air Hangouts was stopped. Basically, I used to leave link in description, and I'd do a live stream. I used to have loads of people on. Okay, and this is a word of warning to anyone out there, and this is why I applaud your caution. The one guy I had on a whole number of live streams who I fell out with because I found out he was talking behind my back. There's another guy I had on a whole number of live streams who suddenly did a video, suddenly emailed someone accusing me of doing something that I hadn't even done, what caused a whole world of eruption. Okay, and the one thing I learned is that I take my time. You've even got to be careful if you know me in comments a lot of the time, because they can turn on you at any point. That's why I keep a very small circle now. That's why, aside from your channel, Scrapbook's channel, if you ever did lives, my channel, and there's a few other channels, I will go on no one's live stream. None. Zip. I stick to myself, and I stick to people I know best from now on. And my commenters and my live chatters, I like to think, and it's great to see a number of my live chatters in your live chat, because these guys are great guys. And a lot of these live chatters I have followed me for a lot of years and are very, you know, respectful, and they can debate in comments, and they can leave comments in live chats without name calling, with no racism, you know, without slurring people or people countries. So I am so appreciative that I have such a good live chat when I do my live streams. It is one of the things I'm most proud of on YouTube, that costing me tough rules, I've managed to build a group of guys who are all great guys, who can get on with each other, can disagree, but do it respectfully, you know, and that is one thing I love about my channel. But I am going to have to get off now, buddy, and find out what my wife was wanting to reach me for. So I will say thank you very much to you. Big shout out to Scrapbook Boxing, Antonio Mosley, and to anyone who does listen in, you know, to our countdowns or our top 5 this or top 10 that. Always remember, it's not necessarily about us being right. We're just listing our lists based on what we think. The main thing is try and take something away from it, or it may stimulate someone to research, or it may stimulate someone to look at a fighter again and think, wow, that fighter's better than I expected. That's the benefit. That is the benefit, the fighters themselves.
That's
and with
right.
that, I shall bow out.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to get off myself. Thanks to everyone in the comments. I just appreciate anyone listening after the fact, and everyone have just a fantastic day.
Yeah, thank you very much, buddy. I shall catch you soon. I'll be in touch, and definitely look forward to that chat with you and Scrapbook. I cannot wait for that, and for future projects. Take care, guys. I'm out.
Take care, folks.